So just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Kathy Smith. I'm a postdoc in the Leverhulme Centre for Wildfires, Environment and Society. And among those of us in the room today are the other organisers of this session. So we've got James Millington just here and Kate Schreckenberg here, also part of the centre. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Timothy Neal from Deakin University, Australia. Each speaker is going to have about 15 minutes for their presentation, and then we'll have kind of 5 minutes for questions directed at that speaker about the presentation, but there'll be time at the end for kind of more general questions. So yeah, I'll hand over to you, Timothy.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to this great group. My name is Timothy Neal. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation down here in Melbourne, Australia, and I acknowledge their elders, past, present, emerging, and as an uninvited guest on their country, feel very grateful for that hospitality. My presentation today, I'm going to stick to the brief, or hope to, and really try and give you an overview based on a number of projects I've been doing over the last 7 years or so in relationship to fire management here in southeastern Australia. So hopefully you can just see my slides. And I've titled it From Stakeholders to Partners because that's very much kind of the broad sweep of what has occurred and is occurring really in the past kind of couple of decades, where non-Indigenous government fire agencies and non-Indigenous industry partners, industry stakeholders, or whatever we might want to call them, are moving from dealing with or collaborating with Indigenous peoples as stakeholders to collaborating with them as partners. That's a kind of set of emic terms that people use in this context. Just a warning that there are a few images in this presentation, and they may contain images of deceased peoples. So a little bit about my background. I'm a non-Indigenous person from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I've been in Australia much longer than I anticipated, and my PhD really focused on settler Indigenous land politics, and that is a thread that I've followed since then. But really, since about 2014, have been involved in research on fire management, specifically interested in issues of risk assessment, risk management policy, as well as we're going to see today, the kind of revitalization of Indigenous fire management here in southeast Australia, which is a context I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. And here are some various things I've written. And probably one of my favorite pieces is a kind of public-facing piece down at the bottom there about what we're talking about when we talk about this thing called cultural burning, a kind of term that's become popular in the last decade here in particular, in relation as a description of Indigenous fire practices. So the areas of focus of my research in this presentation are really a very wide mix of ecology types. We're talking about everything from dry woodlands to basically mallee or desert country, and for instance in Western Victoria or northern South Australia or western New South Wales, temperate rainforest, scrubland, heathland, all kinds of ecology types, but all of them, in various ways, fire ecologies and fire regimes. In particular focus, though, of this work, and driven by the focus of my research partners, is an interest in rural areas and peri-urban areas, or the wildland-urban interface areas where fire risks and human settlements really come into contact. This is a place in Australia, I suppose, defined by its very limited and patchy formal Indigenous land rights recognition. So really since 1993, there has been a national land rights regime that parts of Southeast Australia were relevant to. And then since then, we've seen very patchy recognition and even alternate forms of recognition of Indigenous land rights. But they are really usufructory. I often try and get that word right and often don't succeed, or use rights and consultation rights in relationship to parcels of land. And those rights descend generally from people being able to establish a pre-colonial genealogy to a particular place, though in some cases also people have rights just because they reside in a particular place. So I guess I'm painting a picture here of great ecological diversity, legal diversity, and diversity of landscape fire risks. People will be probably very aware that southeastern Australia, sometimes referred to as the Fire Triangle, is a place of significant historical major landscape fire events, including the 2019-2020 Black Summer fires very much affected this part of the world. 2009 Black Summer fires in Victoria, the 2002 to 2003 fires that affected a lot of the southeastern seaboard. So this is the kind of area that I'm looking at, and as it shows on the right-hand side there, it's a place where cultural fire or indigenous fire projects have been are spread over a wide area, and this was a map that I made in 2019, and I would say it's very much out of date now and would have many more dots upon it if I tried to make it now. So it's an area of significant, revitalization, significant new and recent action in relationship to Indigenous fire management. And part of that has been, I guess, buoyed or carried along by a significant public interest in Indigenous fire management in this part of the world. There's a number of kind of famous books there, or I should say very well read and well-received books there that kind of signal that wave. But to give you a little bit of a longer history of this part of the world, there has been a history of misrecognition of Indigenous fire practices, whether from the colonial frontier, in which fire was seen very much as a nuisance by colonial settlers, as something to be stopped, fire use, I should say, something to be stopped and criminalized, or if not completely stopped by other means. That then in the 1960s and subsequently, fire played a very crucial role in Australia's deep time revolution, which is the rise, well, I should say, the archaeological debates and discovery of Indigenous peoples much longer than previously thought history of care and custodianship for this place, and that read a lot of significant debates about the role of fire in that deep time history, varying from, on the top right there, you see the famous paper by Rhys Jones, or ultimately the equally famous, slightly infamous paper by Duncan Merrilees, depicting a very opposite kind of story of what fire has done on the continent. That is, according to Jones, being a kind of tool for crafting the landscape, and according to Merrilees, a way of destroying its megafauna. But this understanding that Indigenous people had burned on the continent for a very long time was crucial to the formation of what's called the Australian strategy, which is the mainstream use of prescribed burning in the spring and autumn. This was very much justified and continues to be justified on the basis of that long history. To the point that today in southeastern Australia, many white fire managers, think of what they do in prescribed burning as in some way linked epistemologically, historically, ecologically to Indigenous fire management. In terms of the key policy agendas in this place, because the state, or what we'd call in Canada, the province, is responsible for land and emergency management, that is really the most important jurisdiction. And there are all kinds of things there. I've listed some in relationship to Indigenous recognition at the top there. We're moving rapidly to greater and greater joint management of national parks. New South Wales, for example, has pledged to have all national parks be joint managed or handed over to traditional owners by 2030. But other things also are key, I guess, policy agendas. Fuel treatments or prescribed burning is probably the dominant player and possibly the most contentious part of fire management in this part of the world. It's also a multi-million-dollar annual expenditure. Threatened species, particularly kind of charismatic threatened species like koalas and sugar gliders and things like that, are very key, again, to shaping what can and can't be done with fire, what is considered a fire risk and what is not, and the end of native forestry, which has recently been rapidly brought forward, in part by the major fires that we've had, such that that industry is kind of rapidly being decommissioned, and that policy agenda is therefore pushing what is happening in relationship to fire. Nationally is probably a less important jurisdiction for this part of the world. Nationally, the national government really provides funding for payment for ecological services programs like Caring for Country, and kind of sets an agenda for further joint management, but they don't have legal responsibility, and so they're not somebody that people talk about all that much, and even less people talk about the relevance of international agendas or international comparisons. Very few of my partners ever talk about anything other than of that kind of at that kind of jurisdiction level, apart from the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Key motivations and tensions. I guess I've kind of foregrounded some of these. The motivations, or what's motivating a lot of collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups, is that fact that there are now payment for ecosystem economies that people can attach this kind of work to. The declining efficacy of existing approaches, particularly planned burning, is another motivation for new collaborations, new approaches, new ideas that are actually ancient approaches and ancient ideas. Another key motivation amongst colleagues inside government agencies is simply policy compliance, that now, because of some of the factors that I've talked about before in relationship to Indigenous land rights, simply to be policy compliant, people have to show signs that they are collaborating with Indigenous groups. And as I've mentioned, shortcomings of existing approaches in relationship to land management are really a kind of key motivator for, I think, a lot of people. Tensions. That collaboration between non-Indigenous and Indigenous groups in this part of the world. One of my interviewees once remarkably called it an arranged marriage. That people feel that they, especially Indigenous peoples, if they want to be involved in fire management, if they want to manage fire on their country, they have to work with the state. There's not really, there's not a whole lot of choice. There's not a whole lot of opportunities for autonomy, and so collaboration, where it happens, nonetheless kind of happens under a condition that we might call slightly coercive. That there continues to, despite a lot of promising language and promising initiatives, it's proved incredibly difficult for government agencies to actually devolve power over, let's say, approval to do burns, or approval to decide about safety regulations, or insurance for people doing, applying fire to landscapes. That has proven incredibly hard, and it creates a lot of tension. That fire collaborations are often approached as projects that may take 2 years or 4 years, but they nonetheless have a kind of project model, which means they have a discrete beginning and a discrete end. That creates a lot of tension. And finally, the anti-fire sentiment that we've seen. There remain groups, particularly kind of groups concerned about environmental values, who are anti-burning, even if it's done by Indigenous peoples. And so that has been a source of tension. So I've mentioned some of the synergies already that are pushing, these parties together, and are kind of underpinning some of the collaborative work that we're seeing really grow very rapidly. One, a kind of legal recognition that Indigenous peoples have land rights, and so those rights must be integrated into forms of environmental governance. Second, a kind of policy agenda of reconciliation, of movements towards, a more kind of ethical cause. Third, that there are economic streams to underpin this kind of work, often funded by the federal government, but not only, sometimes funded by the private sector. And fourth, I think probably one of the most influential is the rising intensity and frequency of fires affecting residential communities that has again pushed this need, or this desire for approaches other than those that are currently dominant. So I've mapped this out. I won't go through it all because I realize I'm running through time, but that's some more specifics to what I'm talking about, that, we've got an expanding landmass of recognized rights, an increasing political acceptance of those rights, that we have income streams that can support the actual doing of bushfire practices, and finally, publics and also agencies who increasingly realize that current approaches are not reducing bushfire risks in the way that they would like. Ooh. And so we saw after the 2019-2020 fires kind of widespread reporting that cultural burning or indigenous fire management could help save lives and homes. I will kind of flash through these dynamics because I am running out of time, but I've signaled this already. Kind of key challenges: ongoing colonial power dynamics, that the state in its many forms finds it very difficult, even if it wants to, give up power, and sometimes it does not want to. That part of that is public service cultures and politics, worries about their own institutional risk if they do devolve power, if they do allow more indigenous land management, more burning by indigenous peoples, that this presents a risk potentially to them, a reputational risk if something goes wrong. There is generally, I would say, in Southeast Australia, reduced public tolerance for burning, increased numbers of legal challenges against planned burns, especially here in Victoria and also in New South Wales. And so, just to sum up, there's been a lot of different interpretations and continue to be of Indigenous people's relationships to fire in this part of the world, but for a long time, white people, non-Indigenous peoples, have looked to those practices for supplemental value, as I've written about elsewhere, or what, how they might benefit dominant mainstream approaches. In the last 30 years, we've seen a convergence of factors: legal, political, economic, one might say kind of environmental, that have pushed these parties to need to work together. And in that kind of zone of contact, we're seeing a lot of revitalization, I would say, of Indigenous fire practices. And I think that's hopefully almost right on time.
Brilliant, thanks a lot. So let's invite kind of about 4 minutes of questions I think we've got time for, specifically to Tim. And those can be, if people want to type them in the chat, they can, or if they want to speak, maybe raise a hand. I can't see everybody, so I don't know whether they've raised a hand or whether they've written anything in the chat. But
shall I ask one just to start?
Yeah.
So thanks, Timothy. So you mentioned that there's really not that much consideration of international agendas, on that slide of kind of local, national, international agendas. I just wonder if you could speak a little bit more about why that is. Is it just the distance? Is it just the proximity of the local pressures or desires?
I think it's thank you for that question. I think it's just that the drivers are all local and they are largely uncoupled from those international agendas. For example, because fires in Southeast Australia aren't really, they're not integrated into things like emissions counts or emissions abatement schemes. They therefore don't link into climate change all that clearly, except that when we have major fires, people identify their intensity with anthropogenic climate change, and that's where the kind of linkage comes. Generally, I think it's because those factors. I would say a kind of deeper reason, at least on the side of non-Indigenous fire management agencies and science, is because really since the 1960s, it's aggressively pursued a kind of isolationist pathway of we are not doing American science, we're doing Australian science, we're going to have our own fire meters, our own fire behavior models, we're going to have our own training regimes, and that has over time really solidified to ensure that Australian fire science, for example, is fairly inwardly focused.
Right. Yeah. Great. Thanks.
David,
David, do you want to ask your question?
I think you might have to unmute.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is a kind of Australian story, but it occurs in a wider international context, you know, borrowing ideas and getting like imitated widely. And so I just wondered if you could say a little bit, maybe slightly outside your immediate field of expertise, about like how this is the same or different than anywhere else. Like you've already mentioned a little bit about, oh yeah, we're not going to be like those Yanks. But you know, what do you know about, because I know nothing about the extent to which, ooh, that sounds cool, let's like follow the Australians.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that question, David. I would say, I mean, the linkages that I'm aware of are fairly Commonwealth-based ones, where, you know, you have those kinds of drivers that I was talking about in terms of land right recognition, political pressure to respond differently to, you know, increasing landscape fires, that it's not a surprise that we've seen a similar kind of movement and interest in Canada through the same period, and that there are, I'm aware of, you know, exchanges of people moving between those contexts in the last few years, Indigenous fire managers going to Canada, and Canadian fire managers coming here to exchange that kind of information. And a lot of the discussion that I've been privy to is about how do we work with these, you know, agencies? How do we use the rights that we have to get some purchase within this kind of regime? It's not necessarily about like fire practice. It's actually about more about kind of collaborative practice.
Yes, so that raises a really interesting follow-up question, which you've kind of already partly answered. And that is whether the kind of mechanism, the sort of vector for this international collaboration is more around the land rights issue, for which kind of fire happens to be an incidental point of commonality. But it's really about, you know, acknowledging Indigenous land rights and what that means and yada, yada, yada. Or is it, hey, like, we're the fire people, and oh, yeah, like there's this other agenda going on, and how those two things meet up or don't.
Mm. Yeah, interesting. I would say I'm going to split my answer. And to some extent, this is about fire, and to some extent, it's not. The extent to which it's about fire is that, you know, Indigenous peoples here in Southeast Australia, they often articulate a particular relationship to fire as fire being an incredibly important cultural process, cultural object with, you know, all kinds of links into you know, the production of food, the reproduction of social order. But I would say also that definitely I've had interviews and seen this in practice, that fire is also a useful, because of that interest from the outside, because of the interest in what Indigenous peoples might tell us. It's a useful lever. And when other major natural hazard events have come along, those have also been levers. And so I think it's both about fire and also about this. There's also it's an opportunity created by that desire for answers from the outside. So when we had floods recently across really major floods in parts of northern New South Wales, that also has formed a major opportunity for Indigenous groups there to be much more actively engaged and much more actively consulted, because people are looking for answers.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tim. We'll pass on now to Tegan Calman from the Darwin Centre for Bushfire Research in Australia. So whenever you're ready, do take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just sort my screen share out. How is that?
We're not there yet. Oh no, it's happening. Yeah,
There?
brilliant.
Great. Thanks, Tim, for that great talk. There's a lot of context there that's really relevant for the work that I've done in Arnhem Land in Australia. So in the savanna ecosystems, which are very flammable and very hard not to burn, but have nonetheless had a policy of fire suppression since colonisation. And this is in the ecosystem services space of carbon abatement projects in Northern Australia. And I'm starting out with that image from a Northern Australian fire information website. And it's a significant fire scar in November this year across central Arnhem Land. And it's quite relevant to what I'm going to be talking about today in terms of how fire is coming together in this system. So Northeast Arnhem Land in the Australian context, Northern Australia, as I said, savanna biomes all the way from west to east, highly flammable, and about 78% Indigenous rights in the lands there. But the Aboriginal Land Rights Act of 1976 isn't across the entirety of that space, but those places that do have Aboriginal Land Rights Act tenure have a really secure form of tenure that's enabled very ready access to the carbon market when it's arrived. And on the red and grey map there, those are the registered carbon projects in Arnhem Land that have been running for more than a decade now, all Indigenous owned. I had a video here on YouTube to try and give a good display of how this fire management system works. It's by a fellow named Rowan Fisher, who's a very magnificent spatial scientist and spends a lot of time on fire maps. But I'll just talk through it instead. It's in 2004, because of wildfire suppression policies, there was basically huge wildfires going through late in the seasons every year and covering massive amounts of ground and were quite damaging ecologically, which was the driver to come up with a method to reduce the impact on the environment for fires, and so a shift towards early season burning that has then been linked to reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So across large parts of Northern Australia, emissions reductions projects are now conducted with the burning in the early season rather than the later season. The multi-level governance system I'm looking at is quite localised in Arnhem Land, and it's really just one company called the Arnhem Land Fire Abatement Company, which is an Indigenous-owned corporation, and it's looking at how that corporation interacts with the ranger groups, which is the Indigenous Land and Sea Management groups, who've been working with federal funding for quite a long time now, 15 to 20 years across Arnhem Land. And then I'm also looking at how those ranger groups relate to the landowners on that Aboriginal land rights tenure, because they're the people with the actual legal right for the carbon projects. So to make sense of some of the results that came out of the interviews I did with landowners and rangers in Arnhem Land about the governance of these projects, I'll just quickly step through the operational calendar for the Savanna Fire Management projects, because the governance is quite complex within the project. And so that's really looking at pre-season fire planning. There's a heavy emphasis, even though the ranger groups do the operational work of fires, there's a lot of consultation for permissions from the landowners who have the legal right to permit fire on their country. There's consultation and permission sought between ranger groups and landowners to varying degrees, depending on the ranger group structures. And then people go out and do the burning, often again with a lot of integration between landowners and ranger groups, but highly variable. And then there's a little bit of post-season review in terms of how fire went and whether landowners are happy to give ongoing consent for burning to happen across seasons.
So, like, I have to.
Olivia,
But like,
Olivia, we can hear you.
So really what came out of this operations system is that a lot of the strength in fire management outcomes from an Aboriginal landowner perspective came from strong engagement between your landowners and your ranger groups. And that was core to a lot of the Savannah Fire Management Project outcomes that people valued. So the payment for ecosystem services that Tim mentioned that was federally funded is quite constrained because it is government funding. There are a lot of cultural activities that people feel are not met because of that broad cultural significance of fire. A lot of people felt that the ranger money didn't always enable landowners or rangers to undertake a lot of the activities that they wanted to do while they were burning. And so this access to a market has really enabled a lot of discretionary funding. But talking to people, discretionary funding wasn't necessarily the primary outcome of the projects that was valued. It tended to be all of the activity that was supported through the discretionary funding. So a lot of those activities at the top of the results there were a little bit more about politico-cultural outcomes than economic outcomes or even your social outcomes like employment and equipment and infrastructure. When I spoke to 20 people for these interviews. They were all leaders from Arnhem Land in those Savannah fire management projects. And the major barrier that people identified was decision-making without landowner consultation. So that kind of relationship between the land managers and the landowners, the ranger groups and the landowners really fell apart a little bit in some of the governance arrangements, particularly those where there was a long distance for communications, which is more about organisational setup than anything else. And that is changing quite quickly as the discretionary income hits the ground in these projects. A lot of groups are using that income to establish their own organisations at a more local people-place scale, so that decision-making really includes the landowners who have the legal right over those projects. And the other big issue was late dry season burning, which really kind of talks to that articulation across cultures that has been, I guess, of great concern within the literature with a lot of these nature-based solutions carbon projects, is where do some of the boundaries for what makes a great project for carbon emission reduction versus what makes a great project for cultural outcomes for landowners. So that's really a point of tension in the system, because that late dry season burning is sometimes done for cultural reasons. So I'll just talk briefly here about how Arnhem Land fire abatement has tried to harness some of the synergies in this system, and also tried to, I guess, alleviate some of the tensions in terms of trying to get communications across different scales within that system, and trying to ensure that even though you have a very complex global accounting architecture that's meeting a relatively remote area with a difficult time recruiting the kind of skills and capacity to engage with the administrative, business and legal requirements of that global.
You answered me. Interesting question.
Whose question?
Olivia? I think something wrong there. Let me just have a look. Yeah.
You able to mute everybody?
Carry on, Tegan, I think.
Good one,
Okay.
thanks. So Arnhem Land Fire Abatement has really tried to find a way to articulate with that broader national accounting administration and also global and national markets, and still retain the landowners who have the legal rights to the projects, their involvement and oversight of the project. So this is a ridiculously complicated diagram that I'll talk through a bit. So the bottom layer is really the different kinds of governance arrangements that the ranger groups have for their fire operations. And then landowners who represent those regions of the ranger groups sit on the board of Arnhem Land Fire Abatement. And even though there's a lot of business and administration that needs to be translated across cultures between those landowners and the executive officers within those corporations, at the end of the day, the landowners have a kind of vertical hierarchy across this particular multi-level governance system that really helps communication and prioritisation in a system that, because it is so remote and such a large area, has historically been very difficult. So one of the big outcomes from these projects that people have valued is the improved networking and improved communications across the whole of Arnhem Land, just from ensuring that those different scales and levels of landowners, rangers, and then business have ways to link together and communicate their different priorities. So again, I'll just return to this NAFI picture because it was a good story in November when I went in and got the snapshot of the day. Is this big purple area is a fire that's been running for months now at the time of year where emissions reductions, fires are usually suppressed. So it's outside of the emission reduction burning window. And so this is the time of year where fires are generally avoided. But when I asked about, how that particular fire scar has gotten away at this time of year, there was a cultural walk through this part of Arnhem Land back in July, and people started fires. And then there was a request from the people who have responsibilities for those particular areas that fire doesn't get put out because it meets other cultural needs around estates of deceased people. And so basically all activity in that area was quelled for that season. And I guess for the person who was managing those projects, there's an awareness that there's a strong trade-off in terms of income for this season. But the landowners for that area thought that trade-off was well worthwhile in terms of the other cultural metrics that were being met within that system. And again, in a lot of state-funded projects, it's been very difficult for Aboriginal people in this area to really be able to meet their own cultural priorities when they were up against mainstream fire management requirements and funding. So that discretionary funding from these projects is really enabling other priorities to be promoted. So on the whole, the projects are giving really great outcomes for people, would be one of the kind of takeaways that people see a lot of knowledge transfer and cultural practice coming from the projects. And the trade-offs are really around the reliance on brokers to ensure that the ground level decision making within that multi-level system is, I guess, translated effectively into a broader sphere. But I think that's a different level of governance for discussion. This one as a kind of ground-based, what's happening in Arnhem Land and across many other projects in Northern Australia at the moment, is that those fire management projects are meeting a lot of cultural goals, and it doesn't at this point look to be trading off with that idea of carbonification or people feeling constrained by global accounting metrics. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much, Tegan. So again, we've got kind of 5 minutes or so for questions. So please put your hand up or type in the chat if you have a question. Great, one here.
Tegan, I just wanted to ask you a really practical question. I didn't quite get who the rangers are and who chooses them. Are they seem to be a really important group. You know, are they like the sons and nephews of the landowners, or are they a new professional group that has come up which can bring in people from anywhere to learn the skills, or who are they?
Yep, great question. And I do apologise, this slide deck has been pruned. And I haven't got the one in there that tries to explain that idea. So the ranger groups, a lot of them are landowners and do have responsibilities within the area that they manage those lands, but there's also a lot of landowners who are not rangers. And there are also community members who don't have responsibilities in the region who get employed as rangers to undertake that work. So there's this really powerful innovation in the governance of the ranger groups in Arnhem Land in particular, where increasingly there's a role that's the senior ranger. So you have the ranger coordinator, that's usually a state-funded position and does a lot of the translating and brokering work for the group, so maintains a lot of the external relationships with the state and other organisations. But increasingly within these Savannah fire management projects, you've also got senior rangers, and they tend to be given that role because of significant cultural knowledge for the region, and it's their job to ensure that when rangers are undertaking activities, they're really making sure that as much cultural practice and knowledge transfer is being embedded into the ranger group activity as possible. And so quite frequently that means knowing who the right person for each place is and how everybody relates to each other, and how to ensure that those people are getting opportunities to access country and talk to the right people while those ranger group activities are happening. So frequently the ranger group will be employed with fairly stable positions, but these Savannah fire management projects have really enabled literally hundreds of people each season to get employment as kind of casuals, so that they can undertake work in their particular area that embeds the work with a lot of meaning.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up to that? How well does that seasonal work articulate with other work that's available? So is it kind of okay that it's a seasonal thing?
I guess that's a very diverse answer. Like, it really varies depending on the different communities in terms of access to other work. So one of the ranger groups, the Jarwin, have they're based in Katherine, which is one of the larger townships in the Northern Territory, and they have really quite a busy schedule of paid ecosystem, land management work throughout the year, and so tend to have a full-time position that would reflect, or at least mirror in some way, a mainstream Australian employment arrangement. Whereas in some of these communities that are really very remote, and particularly outstations, where there's not a lot of employment opportunity beyond what the state provides in welfare, then people, I guess, often have quite complex hybrid economies with a lot of customary activity also contributing to their livelihoods. And so then it becomes a little bit more of a livelihoods question than a full-time employment question. So people often value the seasonality and casual nature of the work because they're able to attend to other priorities. But that said, that certainly wouldn't be everybody. There'd be a kind of diversity of aspirations across Arnhem Land in terms of their will to engage with I guess more secure employment or longer term employment.
Great, thanks. I think that's us at times, unless there's any more burning questions.
I can't see anything in the chat or hands up. So
All right, thanks a lot, Tegan. So we'll hand over now to Glynis Humphrey from the University of Cape Town, South Africa.
Hi everyone, let me just share my screen there. Thanks very much, Tegan and Tim, that was great. Got some questions for afterwards. Let me just share that, start. Okay. Right, so what I've done, okay, let me just introduce myself. I'm Glynis from the African Climate Development Initiative from the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And I'm going to be sharing a case study from Namibia that was based on my PhD, which involved knowledge from the Khoisan people and the Humber Kush people, but also at the government level, which involved the ministry and park management in a protected area. This area was quite unique because people are part of the protected area, which is actually quite unique in Southern Africa. Most people have been removed from these areas where wildlife and tourism operates. So I'll be sharing this case study, but then interweaving the questions interweaving the questions into the case study for interest. Okay, so just taking, is that the, ooh. Okay, I just want to do, sorry, my pop-ups, am I sharing the right, sorry, do you mind if I think this is the PDF?
Yeah, it's not showing in full screen.
Is it not? Oh, okay, let me just see. Sorry, let me
If you
just,
want to
is that better?
start the slideshow. Yeah, there we go.
Okay, that's it. Okay, excellent. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I just wanted to draw attention, particularly in Southern Africa and in South Africa, a lot of the understanding of fire ecology up until the 80s and actually till the early 20th century a lot of it was focused on only understanding fire regimes, and there was a lot of exclusion. There wasn't recognition of the cultural and the social aspects. And it's a lot more, it's becoming, well, there's a lot more studies in Southern Africa that are really addressing why people burn on the ground, how, and just analyzing their reasons, which is really great. But just to introduce the framework for my research, I've used pyrogeography, which is also from Australia, which has been very useful, a very useful framework, because it really it adopts the biology and fire, the geophysical environment, the topography, but really recognizes the society and culture. And I think this has been a framework which has really been useful to actually help people understand the complexities of bringing in sort of societal knowledge, but also cultural and indigenous knowledge. The reason why there's probably been a bit of a delay with bringing in the social aspects, particularly in Southern Africa, is that, you know, it takes a long time. It does take, social data is time intensive. Social and cultural, it's time intensive, but there's also shifting perceptions, and there's frequently when it comes to fire, there's political dynamics. But without actually without addressing these aspects, looking at fire management and governance is actually impossible. So in order to address fire, you have to include people in order to address the bigger picture. So this is important because of the fact that the decisions that we have, the decisions that need to be made in the immediate time period involve national policies, but have an impact on communities and people's livelihoods, which are dependent on ecosystem services. It's really important to address the historical aspects, but also the current climate, to actually bring people together to actually address fire management on the ground. And I just wanted to use this diagram because I find it quite useful for explaining what's governance levels in Southern Africa, but where we're missing our attention and where we need to draw attention to. So at the continental level, we're aware that climate anomalies like the El Nino Southern Oscillation drive the meta-fire regime and biome persistence at that level. When you shift to the more landscape level, you've got rainfall variability and fire and vegetation feedbacks, which become critical to understand. So you understand the fire pattern that's emerging. At the local level, you have weather and you have the fire event and biomass, and that's where ignitions become important, and that's where people, the people angle really comes in. So from a Southern African perspective, from a governance level, we have this Southern African development community, and we have a regional fire management program, which was rolled out in 2010, which hasn't moved to date yet into a Southern African context, in the sense that there's been limited funding for addressing fire management issues in different African countries. Basically, the funding goes elsewhere instead of into natural resources. At the landscape level, we have national park management plans and national policies. And sometimes in Southern Africa, we have policies of fire suppression, and we have policies that encourage early dry season burning in order to address the late dry season fires, which are problematic. So at the local level, we have traditional fire management practices, and then we have community-based integrated fire management. And then we have managers and farmers and herders on the ground, and that's where the ignitions happen, and that's where we really need attention in Southern Africa to actually manage fire. Okay, so I just thought I'd use that as an example. So in sub-Saharan Africa, we know we have these dynamics. So we've got interactions between rainfall, vegetation, and fire, and grazing interactions with wild herbivores and domestic stock, changing our biomass levels. But then the important aspect is that we've got ignitions on the ground. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. But what we do know of our fire regime patterns, and it's becoming more pertinent, is that our fires are becoming frequent. They're frequent, they're cool, and they're small. And our fire frequency is actually decreasing because of the change of land use on the ground, but also because of the change in vegetation types. So that's just to give you a picture. So this is to introduce my study area. I've worked mostly in the Central Kalahari, predominantly in Namibia, but also in Botswana. My study area where I've worked is Babwata National Park. This area is important because it's part of the Kavango Transfrontier National Transfrontier Area, which is a conservation area, but is in proximity to a World Heritage Site, which is the Okavango Delta, which is a really pristine, high densely populated, from a biodiversity perspective. It's a very important area in Southern Africa. But this area is also very interesting because it's mixed. There's a conservation zone with an expanding cattle herd and livestock economies, which are really growing at the moment. And of course, this is a mixed savanna grassland. It's a mixed grassy savanna woodland area. As I said earlier, the research that came from this research really involved the indigenous knowledge and the government. So that was really exciting to come at that, or to bring those two together to understand how people understood fire. But yeah, and that identified with Tegan, that's where the synergies are, is that you bring these two, that there's a cultural recognition of how people burn and why people burn. And then there's also an understanding of why the government burns, and how those, those when you bring those two together, it really creates a synergy. So just to give some context on the ground, why people use fire in this landscape. So people burn to increase the productivity of the grass, to attract game, for hunting reasons, but also it's easier for people, for the Khoisan and people to track, because once you've burnt the ground, it's basically a spatial dimension. It's easier to see the tracks on the ground, and animals are easier to track. But people also burn because there's potentially what would be perceived as dangerous animals, for example, lions and elephant and buffalo, and thick bush. So people would burn the vegetation to actually remove the bush, so that for safety reasons. So people burn to increase the productivity, but also for livestock grazing. So there's a lot of mixed use of fire going down in this ecosystem, but also because it's a very remote area. People are dependent on the land, basically, for natural resources and what we'd call felt food resources, which is plants that are used by the communities for sustenance. So basically, the plants are ecosystem services. So there's a lot of focus on that, and people are burning for those reasons, to maintain these plants or to protect them. But people also burn at certain times of the year to remove the biomass, to prevent the late dry season fires from impacting the village areas. So this is just to give you a couple of reasons why people burn. on the ground. Now, to show you some of the conflicts which have rolled out on the ground, I'll just talk about the history that's rolled out in Namibia. So from the 1700s, the Khoisan, this was an ancestral land, early dry season burning and the use of fire has been part of their cultural history for millennia. The Khoisan moved from a nomadic livelihood to a more sedentary livelihood because of the expansion and change in land use, which put pressure on them. But then what happened is we had restrictive governance coming in, so colonialism, and then we had independence happen at the same time, and at the same time there was the South African border war, which was in the border between Namibia and South Africa, which resulted in the disruption of indigenous practices. Because of the political landscape, the Namibians refused to grant the traditional communities living there a traditional authority, which is a mandate which gives communities a political voice, that was non-existent in this area, which resulted in the loss of traditional fire knowledge. But in the 20th century, there was all of a sudden this shift to a more of a better understanding of fire management, and a shift to early dry season burning, which came out in the fire management plans, and importantly, recognition of traditional fire knowledge for the first time in history that was actually written and incorporated into these fire managements, into this particular fire management strategy, which leaves a mark in history. But yet, you know, in the 21st century, there's still a lot of nothing. It's not a perfect system. Indigenous knowledge has been acknowledged, although that would vary about that. You know, that it depends on who you talk to on the ground from a park level, how much of that is actually integrated and how much that is actually respected on the ground. But okay, so there's still a lot of work to be done. But, you know, in the 21st century, there's still a lot going on. So we've still got rising temperature, we've got climate change, there's still big fires that happen in the landscape, there's bush encroachment and an expanding intercultural, different groups moving into the area. And there's an increase in livestock in the area, which creates a lot of ecological uncertainty. So what the system, just to summarize the system, there was an era of traditional fire knowledge and social change, change in governance, okay, change in protected area management, change in land use, and then at the same time there were these historical events that happened. But the positive aspect is that there was a recognition of community-based integrated fire management that happened on the ground, which resulted in a change in recognizing and acknowledging indigenous communities and how people do burn. Okay, but at the same time, there's still a lot of ecological uncertainty. There's a changing fire regime. There's still questions around climate change and carbon dioxide fertilization of the plants and increase in vegetation. So just to give another context, Namibia borders onto Botswana, where there's still a policy of fire suppression, which has been since 1997, but there's a culture of herding, a big culture of herding that the government depends on because it finances the GDP. So there's lots of export of meat. Sorry, am I running over time? Oh no. Okay, so
you're at 13 minutes.
Okay, great. Okay, so the cattle industry is important because that's a way of controlling the biomass, but fire is essential for the ecological functioning of the system. But they're on the border of Namibia, so there's often a lot of cross-border fires that happen. So this is there's that situation, and then we have in large tracts of the Kalahari, there's woody encroachment, really large sections of area due to overgrazing because of the high livestock carrying capacity, which impacts on the ecosystem services. And this is resulting in a loss of ancient grasslands. It's impacting the biodiversity. It impacts on people's livelihoods because grazing and water are tightly coupled, and the rates of land use are uncertain. But this is really critical given climate change. And this really impacts on a government level because of the loss of important rangelands. And the rangelands are critical for wildlife and livestock. So this is these are recent photos from a field trip that I took this year of some of the tracts of land that are being burnt that will obviously regenerate with rainfall, but there are issues that need to be addressed that it just shows you that, you know, there's a lot of work to be done. Yeah, but this has consequences at the local and national scale, as mentioned, and also has consequences at the global scale for human health and biodiversity and global climate. So the gap in governance is managing the grazing and water and fire management triangle together with land cover change. Okay. Some of the synergies that I mentioned, what has really been great to see in this situation has been the recognition of indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge and the empowerment of local communities and giving managers the authority to burn. So this has resulted in the promotion of integrated fire management, but it's not quite at the stage where I think there's total recognition, and there's still some tension around indigenous practices and burning. So just to highlight that. Okay. So where the real challenges in fire governance really emerges is sort of what it is that there needs to be a rebalance of investments. So there's a lot of still focus on the terminology of fire suppression and fire prevention in not so much in Namibia, but in the surrounding countries like Angola and Botswana, but what would really help is the shift away from that terminology to focus on fuel management, but using fire. So using fire to manage fire and to manage the vegetation. And that would be a very positive shift, so that fire is actually used and seen as a really positive aspect. Okay. There's a real need to focus on cross-border collaboration. There's ultimately a lack of that across borders. And there's not in the surrounding countries, there's a lack of recognition of the local knowledge. This really, what really needs to be taken into context is the socioeconomic conditions. And currently in Southern Africa, there's a lot of initiatives that are focusing on carbon credit mechanisms, which undermine the communities living on the ground. And there's a lot of inequity and equitable circumstances where people aren't really benefiting. There's no benefits to people on the ground, and people that are selling the carbon credits are making a fortune, but are changing the systems on the ground, and their emissions are carrying on as business as usual. I know the situation in Australia is very different, and that's a very different context, but that's why location and context and scale is really critical. But it's not only further, the carbon credit mechanism and the explosion of this is really a great threat to the management of fire and the people that live in this ecosystem. Okay. So just to highlight, just to bring out at an international level, just to summarize, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals do not explicitly mention fire, and fire impacts every single sustainability goal. And it's really, the water governance seems to be on par, but the fire governance just seems to be flatly ignored. And that's really critical to managing water resources and land and vegetation. So that's something that fire really needs to be given the attention it deserves at the international scale. Okay, that's just to thank all the literature, and then thank you. Yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Glynis. Okay, we have a couple of minutes for questions. Anyone want to jump in with one?
Thanks, Glynis. That was really interesting. You highlighted the different levels from continental down to the really local level there. I just wondered if you could explain a little bit more about and you highlighted the kind of promotion of integrated fire management. Just wondered what institutional mechanisms exist or that we need to improve the kind of cross-scale, cross-level interaction of those existing management mechanisms that we've got.
Okay, that's a very pertinent question, because that's really what's really that's the integrated fire management it's what's really needed, and we need cross-scale collaboration and cross-border collaboration. And it would be really helpful if it would, in order to facilitate this, I think that the different institutions that are managing fire. So, for example, in Southern Africa and internationally, we have Working on Fire and the Fire Protection Association, which work the FP. They work with farmers on the ground in the commercial areas. That's just to give you an example of that, an institution like that. But then, to give you an example, there's other projects. So NGOs, for example, and consultancies like GIZ that have focused on cross collaboration and integrated fire management. There seems to be a lack of synthesis and bringing people together to actually, all the stakeholders together to actually talk about a common ground. And I think, and then together with the local governance at the national level. So that would really help. I think that would really help address and actually allow integrated fire management to happen, because it would increase the knowledge uptake, but would also allow for the different perceptions and different understandings to evolve. And that would be great, but it hasn't. We're still a long way from there, I feel. And I also feel that the integrated fire management, the terminology is actually left out of. It's left out of. How can I say? It comes across in a lot of NGO report. It comes out in a lot of NGO reports and a lot of sort of localized regional reports, but it's kind of left out of in Southern Africa, out of the more fire science. And I think we need to start merging. We need to start bringing them together to actually highlight and actually increase the awareness how much integrated fire management is needed on the ground. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, great, thanks.
There's a question here, hand up from Rachel.
Well, we'll take one more, but then I think we need to move into discussion.
Sure.
Yeah, hi, thanks so much for that really fascinating talk. I really love some of your slides as well, showing all that complexity and making it digestible. I just wanted to know more about the livestock issue, because you were saying that livestock has been increasing in the region. Then you mentioned also export of that livestock, and I was wondering about some of the reasons, you know, who are they new groups in the landscape with those herds, or are they existing groups who are now increasing their herds? And something more about the dynamics of that I was curious about. And if there was any time for clarification, you mentioned also the Okavango, and I was wondering to what extent is the dynamics of fire on peat an issue that you're familiar with, or you know, have worked with in that area? Because so far as I know, there's been very little on the Okavango, and it seems a really interesting gap. Significant gap.
Thanks for your questions, Rachel. That's okay. Let me start with the cattle story. Okay, let me give a local example. So, and then I'll move to a more regional example. So from a local perspective, what's happening in Babwata National Park, there's two different communities living in the area. There's the Khoisan and the Humbakush, and the traditional authority, the Khoisan don't have a traditional authority, and the Humbakush do. And the Humbakush people are actually shifting. There's a lot more intercultural shifting going on, and integration that's happening in the savannas. And the Humbakush people own the cattle, so they're shifting the cattle into the park. Okay, so that gives you a local context. Which is causing a lot of tension with the Khoisan, who don't own cattle, and there's generally, historically, there's been a lot of conflict between the two different groups. Okay, so at a regional level, that it's a very pertinent question that you raise about livestock. It's okay. So Botswana. There's a big beef industry, and cattle are exported, and it's a huge financial draw for the country. But there's a lack of recognition of fire management policies, and that probably more than likely is a lack of understanding how important it's an absence of recognition, probably, of the ecological functioning that fire has, and what it could do for the country to actually manage. So that it would be wonderful if there was recognition how important fire would be for managing the ecosystem in combination with having, sustaining the livestock herds together with the wildlife. But that would mean that the government would have to come on board and actually really acknowledge that fire management is critical. So what's really, I'll give you another example. What's happening is there's an expansion of a really fascinating, interesting project that is rolling out across Southern Africa called Herding for Health. And this is a project that's it was run by Conservation International, and it's actually working very closely with local communities to manage, to help people manage livestock and actually give the local communities more time to actually do other tasks and focus on other income earning jobs. But at the same time, it's the cattle herds are increasing in size. And I think there's a lot of, it's a really new project. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's also a lot of learning curve. There's a lot to be learned there, because there's climate change and changing rainfalls, and there's been scenarios of a lot of cattle mortality, and really impacting on the communities, because then the communities lose their livestock, which they've given to the program. So there's a lot of dynamics there which are quite controversial, but really relevant, and that really need to be addressed. And I think the program has the right intent and the right. I mean, it's working very closely with the communities, but I think there's a lot of ground to be. There's a lot of ground and a lot to be learned there still. Yeah. In terms of the Okavango Delta, I think you asked about the peatlands and the burning. That the peatlands, I'll just answer from the knowledge that I have. I don't think I'm an expert on the peatland burning, but it's something it's ecologically, the peat fires start and they burn for a long period of time, but it's an ecological occurrence that's happened for a long period of time. But there is a lot of, I think there's a good number of papers on that, and I think it's part of the system, but that's what I can say. Sorry, that's well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sure.
Great, thanks a lot, Glynis. So we've got about 15 minutes left, and we thought it would be really great to invite some questions that are kind of aimed at all the speakers, to think about kind of how these different locations are similar or different, and how these kinds of challenges and tensions particularly could differ. So yeah, I mean, I certainly have questions, but I want to let other people speak.
Oh, has their hand up, so we could start with. Oh,
okay, brilliant. Thanks, all.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks all for the amazing talks. Super fascinating. One thing that seemed to come through a couple of times was carbon markets, and the fact that they're not working for people. So I guess my question is to all the speakers, there's this idea that's starting to emerge out that nature-based climate solutions, or carbon offsets or whatever, need to work for people first and carbon second. So what would a carbon market look like in your region that's working for the local people first?
So yeah, I don't know if can we get you all up on the screen? Yeah.
Big local question.
I don't know if you want to just go in the order that you spoke, perhaps, to make life easier.
Okay, sure. Thank you for that question, Ol. And I think in my part of the world, indigenous peoples have largely been excluded from the major carbon opportunities. Like here in Southeast Australia, the kind of three dominant methods are reforestation, avoided deforestation, also known as the Australian clause, and burning methane for energy production. So things involving fire really only relate to revegetation, and those are opportunities that, firstly, Indigenous landholders have largely been excluded from because of the timings of their rights, and now those methods are being phased out. So it's a kind of very interesting moment here in southeastern Australia, where there's a real need for new carbon methods and a real uncertainty about what those might be. Soil carbon, for example, blue carbon relating to marine environments. And it will be interesting to see the extent to which Indigenous peoples are brought in as partners to those to those kinds of methods. But I think it's quite a different context to the one that Tegan and Glenys are talking about.
Thanks, Tim.
Agreed. Thanks, Tim. Certainly, the Savannah Fire Management Method has been received really enthusiastically by Aboriginal landowners across Northern Australia. And there's not been the same questions regarding integrity of the method as some of those methods that Tim mentioned. It's a really big issue in Australia at the moment. And it's not just the integrity of the method, it's in the integrity of the governance and the institutions overlooking the application of those methods is quite controversial in Australia at the moment. But as I say, the Savannah Fire Management Method is unusually transparent, and it's super interesting because that is because of its cross-cultural nature. The government put all of this extra money into transparent interfaces to make it more accessible for landowners. And so that has really meant that a lot of different people at different scales of that particular industry are able to access data and information about those projects that really confirms the ground reality. And that same data is not available in other nature-based solution projects. So that's kind of an interesting anomaly with Savannah Fire Management. And I guess the other observation regarding the success of Savannah Fire Management carbon projects really comes back to that question of shared governance. So the vast majority of the carbon projects in Northern Australia, it's Aboriginal owned land and an Aboriginal owned project. And so even though the governance layers are quite complex and still have a lot of intercultural components, the ownership of the projects is quite clear, whereas on joint management projects that I've worked on and certainly observed across national parks, it's a little bit more what Glenys was talking about in terms of the integration of interests is much, much harder when you're trying to bring in a business model where you've already got really contested notions of what fire is being used for and what the priorities are for the application of fire. So it is a little bit varied even within Savannah Fire Management, depending on the autonomy of the landowners to get their project outcomes.
Yeah.
And I did also want to say, just quickly, that I in no way wanted to imply that landowners are against the Savannah Fire Management projects. They really are very well celebrated in Northern Australia as quite a radical relief from previous access to market. Like there's a lot of celebration about the opportunities that have been provided.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tegan. Okay, so what I can, as I said, the situation in Australia is extremely sophisticated in comparison to what we have in Southern Africa. And what my immediate and my immediate response to what would be needed if a successful carbon credit project would be rolled out in Southern Africa or in an African country is that it's a really great understanding of the people on the ground would be needed. So a context, I can't emphasize that enough. Context is so important when it comes to market access, to managing finances. A lot of these communities are poverty stricken. They basically live off, a lot of the communities in Southern Africa are really dependent on natural resources and don't really deal with an economy as such. So there's a really, before the introduction of any sort of market access and money exchange system, that there's a lot of work to be done for people to actually, I think, understand the trading mechanisms that are being implied. I think what would really be important is, I guess, how can I say this? The context is key. And I think the actual addressing the inequalities on the ground and a really transparent situation where the carbon credits are actually going and what is the actual full picture of how a carbon credit mechanism actually works. So if the explanation of where the finances are going and what are the ecological benefits and how will the local people be involved in that, how will they participate in that, and what are the benefits for them on the ground. And then the whole emission factor, which is I feel is quite uncertain. It's an uncertain, what's really hard is that you're talking about emissions, which are emissions we know that they happen, but they're intangible. So how do you explain those things? How do you explain those things to communities? So that's some of the questions that I have. But I think there's a lot of ground. There's a lot of ground there's a lot of ground to be done with if this rolls out in Southern Africa. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. It's a very good question. Yeah, thanks.
Can I just ask a really quick clarification question, Glynis? So you mentioned these existing carbon projects. Are they linked to fire, or is this kind of the integrated fire management that you mentioned linked to carbon markets in any way, or are the carbon projects you're talking about related to things other than fire?
I think you get both. So I think there's both. They are being trying to link to fire to generate. So basically there is an argument, and there was a recent paper, or a couple of months ago, there was a paper published on linking carbon credits to fire management, and then changing the season of burn, which caused, it's controversial because we still need late dry season fires in our landscapes. And it's the actual, I don't think, it is linked to fire in a way. Yeah, it's definitely linked to fire. I can't give you an example. I can't give you an exact example where, but yeah.
Thanks. We've probably got time for one more question.
Do you mind if I ask a question? Can I ask a question? So
Yeah.
Yes.
I'd love to ask a question. So Tim, you spoke about it's actually very similar to the question that was asked to me. So I want to actually ask it. So I'm just really interested in how because when you think about governance, there's some very pertinent issues with governance, and sort of it starts at national governance, and then luckily the local governance is improving. But so because one of the bigger problems is, and this is one of the problems that the communities talk about, is sort of but also at a regional and a provincial level, is the lack of funding. So you spoke about your payment for ecosystem services and the fact that your PS systems are funded by the federal government, and that there's a bit of a tension between these independent projects which have a lifespan. And so I think I'd love to think more about that, about how we address that problem, because it's a similar problem that we've got in Southern Africa. You get these independent projects that have money, that have a lot of funding. The funding dissipates in a period of time in the project lifespan, and then the project's finished, and then everyone's just left in the lurch. And how do we synthesize? How do we actually bring the governance to a level of, because what we really need is a sustainable approach that actually builds on different knowledge levels and actually leaves a foundation. So how would we actually do that? It's a tough question.
Yes, big question.
Tough question, yeah.
Yes. Let me clarify. Thank you for the question, guys. I appreciate it. And yeah, I guess let me clarify that as in, I guess as Kagan's presentation suggested, as in Southeast Australia, there are a variety of funding sources, but yes, the Commonwealth Government is one of the largest sources, as is state governments, as to a lesser extent are philanthropics, as to a lesser extent are private industries like the forestry industry, for example. So what we're seeing, I guess, recently, particularly here in Victoria, where I live, and New South Wales, the adjoining state, is new attempts to create experimental kind of forums or caucuses where the leads of Indigenous landholding groups meet with the leads of government fire agencies and government land management agencies to attempt to kind of have group discussions. Because what we have currently, where we have successes, it's very much on a kind of local scale. People know each other. You know, there's one-to-one kind of interactions, and people are becoming frustrated with that. And so trying to create these kind of forums at the kind of most pertinent scale, which is the statewide scale, and convene those conversations there. And I'm involved in one of those here in Victoria, which endeavoring to kind of create a new hybrid caucus that would be able to continue to have these conversations about, and that would therefore form a form of governance. One thing also that's come out of those conversations is the idea of eventually producing a Indigenous fire agency that would also operate at the same kind of scale as the state. So again, it could be a body that could speak at that scale, and therefore that would be a way of overcoming some of these governance issues where, as you're saying, I mean, your context that you're talking about is even more complex, different countries, different land tenures, different, what scale could bring those together, I don't know. But here it's the state, not the national scale, that is the one that is prevailing.
Thank you. I really
Right.
I really like Tegan's example of the rangers and their involvement with. That seems I've seen that model in other contexts, in other projects, and it seems, that's it's that at the local scale would be very useful. But yeah, it's the funding for those rangers to actually work with Indigenous communities, but then to actually, if the funding could be recognized by government, that would be first class. Yeah.
And that wasn't easily won in Australia. That was a long, hard struggle for Aboriginal people to get that funding implemented, and it really came out of community development wages, so welfare payments, and Indigenous groups gathered and said, well, if we're going to get paid, this is the work. Instead of painting rocks in a township, we'd much prefer to go and do meaningful land management work. And that really has been a national movement of individual groups really fighting very hard to cobble together often very short-term funding at the beginning. And it's really only recently, with the recognised social successes of those groups, so the great outcomes for people in areas that the government has really struggled to support effectively, that the Indigenous land and sea management movement is getting more funding for longer time periods. So it is still a little precarious, but it's certainly not as precarious as it was in the past, and it certainly grew from very small beginnings.
I think we're really sadly at time, which is a shame, because I think there's more questions in the chat, and I think we all in the room have more questions. So yeah, I think maybe we can share some of those questions that are still there by email, or people could get in touch by email. And I think we're really keen to try and draw together both from the presentations we've had now and the ones we'll have later this afternoon, which focus more on North America, South America and Europe, draw something together. So we'll be in touch with everyone who's attended to see where that can go. Yeah. So yeah, thanks very, very much, especially to the speakers.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm regrettably going to be asleep during session 2, and I imagine Tegan will be too.
Yeah. We'll be recording it, so we'll make the recordings available.
Great. Okay,
excellent.
great.
Thank
Thanks,
so much.
Thanks very much.
Okay, cheers.
Right.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 See you.
And
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second session of trade-offs and synergies in multi-level fire governance. We had a good session this morning. I know that given the time zones, well, the whole reason we've got two different sessions is to try and account for time zones around the world. And given those time zones, I know that probably many people in this session weren't in the first session. But not to worry, we're going to try and kind of bring any themes that we explored in the first session over into this session. We'll make the recording of the presentations available from the first session later. So maybe after this session, you can go back and have a look at those. And then maybe there's some opportunity we can follow up afterwards if people have comments on those. So my name's James Millington, and we're here in King's College, London, at the Leverhulme Centre for Wildfire, Environment and Society. And we also have Kathy Smith and Kate Schreckenberg and Adriana Ford and Chege Muthuro. Is that right? Yes. Yeah, but Amos. Amos. So we have 4 speakers. We should move over to those soon now so that we can have some time at the end for discussion. So we'll go straight to our first speaker. Bibiana, if you'd like to share your screen, and I'll leave you to introduce yourself.
Yes.
There we go. That's great.
Is it okay?
Yeah, it looks great. Looks perfect. Thanks very much, Bibiana.
Well, thank you very much for this invitation. I am so pleased. It's an honor for me to participate in this event and and share with you the experiences learning, implementing intercultural fire governance in Canaima National Park in Venezuela. Well, Canaima National Park is located in the extreme southeast of Venezuela, in the center of Guyana Yield, and in the northern part of Amazonia. It has an extension of 30,000 square kilometers, becoming the third largest park in Venezuela and in the Guyana Yield. It was declared the UNESCO World Heritage Site because of singular physiographical, geological, and enormous biological value. And it comprehends the Caroni River basin that provides 70 to 80% of the total hydroelectrical energy in the country. Although the extension of the tropical humid forest, the dominant landscape is formed by savannas that are fire dependent and tropical humid forests that they are very vulnerable to the fire. The Canaima National Park is the home of the Pemon indigenous people that belongs to the Carib language group. They comprehend 3 different groups: Camaracoto, Arecuna, and Taurepan. And the use of fire for shifting agriculture or Sweden agriculture and hunting is the most common practice by indigenous people, and is constitute the main subsistence activities. There are very controlled fires, and they are implemented in a very sophisticated way, especially in the Sweden agriculture, because fire promotes the release of nutrients to the poor and acidic soil typical of the tropical areas. So it was a key factor for the evolution and development of these communities. However, fire exclusion has been the main fire management strategy, and since 1982, the corporate company, hydroelectrical company, and the park administrator developed this program to protect the high basin of Caroni River and Canaima National Park, and to extinguish, especially to eliminate, combat, or extinguish the fire before enter the forest. Although the enormous investment in human resources and technology and the force of suppressions, usually only the 13% of the total fire were able to suppress due to because it's a big park, a big area, and fire is base of the culture of Pemon people. This program create a permanent conflict with indigenous people that use fire as life. For them, fire is life, is the main substance and activity. In 1999, we were invited to do a long-term experiment in order to understand the drivers of fire behavior and impact on vegetation, soil, and atmosphere. With the National Fund, we developed a long-term experiment in 21 plants along the savanna forest transition that is typical of Grand Savanna, the eastern part of the Canaima National Park, and it's the area with most indigenous people. We developed different treatment with respect to the season, the frequency, and intensity of fires. We knew how to make do the design of the experiment, but we didn't know how to make fires. So we invited indigenous communities and the firefighters of the hydroelectrical company to join the experiment in a very collaborative way. And we did following their advice and replicating the traditional practices. In the right side, you can see the two graphs that show the main results with respect to the biomass accumulation. The black one illustrates the fuel load with respect to the years since last fire, and the upper graph shows the dead green or dead life proportion of the biomass accumulation. Well, one of the most important results that we could create a different heterogeneous pattern of biomass accumulation or fuel load, depending of the history of the plot with respect to the fire occurrence. The second second result that this was necessary a minimum amount of biomass to promote the spread of fires in the plot. And the third it was very impressive that the fire exclusion promotes not only the biomass or fuel load, but also the high proportion of the dead biomass with respect to the live biomass. So fire suppression strategy leads to an increase in dry fuel loading, promoting high intensity fires. I will show the important necessity to change the paradigm of fire exclusion in the park. Our results show also that the capacity, considering the heterogeneity of fire histories, of different patch with different fire histories, the creation of patch mosaic burning that could act as firewalls to the spread of fires. And this is exactly or similarly to the ancient practice or traditional practice employed for centuries by the Pemon people that they do in cooperative burnings very close to the forest to protect them to the advance of fires, because for them forest is the principal ecosystem or area that provide food resources and other materials. So the main conclusion is the scientific knowledge support and ancestral knowledge of Pemon, and principally open possibilities for a new approach for fire management in the Canaima National Park, where traditional Pemon approach is to fight fire with fire. From this moment, we considering these results, how this information contradicted the policies that were employed in the park, we decided to start action research projects involving different actors, mainly indigenous people, but also government agencies, firefighters, and researchers, in order that through the knowledge exchange, to promote legitimate and sustainable environmental fire management policy in the park. To promote these activities, we developed participatory methodology together with Cobra Collective in order to foster the integration, to overcome historical tensions and conflicts. We implemented participatory videos, intercultural workshops, and participatory scenario analysis. The participatory video was especially very important for indigenous communities because it was a way to register the traditional practices of use of fires and to change them with the younger members of the communities. Well, here, well, I mentioned some synergistic elements that helped us to promote this change of paradigm. One of them, the start of it was the covenant. It was very important, the long term, that we were able to exchange with communities and to try to create trust and confidence. And for them was so important that the researcher for first times recognize and promote the traditional practices as very valuable. Other very important point to promote the integration was the common objectives. Due to climate change, the loss of cultural practices, and the land change, now there is the new appearance of new type of fires, very, very intense, and the communities, nor the firefighters are able alone to confront or to avoid or to manage them. So the other important topic was the acceptance of valid interlocutors to join skill, knowledge, to promote the integration, to confront the solutions together, and the construction of a solution based on negotiation. And of course, the implementation. One point of implementation, we realized the necessity to revitalize the cultural capital of the communities. So because, well, these are some challenges or constraints we confront along these processes. Maybe the most important is the enduring transculturation process that it was promoted by history of colonization, the influence of religion missions that even today they're in charge of education in the very Western way. And of course, the imposition of dominant discourse by non-indigenous authorities and how to manage the territory. This created historical conflicts over natural resource use and conservation policies through zero-fire policy implementations that, of course, the indigenous people historically rejected because they didn't recognize the value of their practices. And one is that is very common along Latin America and many places globally, is the stigmatization of the indigenous people as the cause of the wildfires. And it's very interesting that the policymakers, media, there is a misconception between that all fires are wildfires. And it's a very, very big difference because wildfires are uncontrolled expression of fires, while indigenous fire management are very sophisticated, very controlled. We respect the time, how, who, and for what is going to do and is planned. No. Well, until now, we have very important advances. Of course, the dialogue and active learning together process between indigenous communities, scientists, and institutions. Especially there is respect and valorization for indigenous knowledges by institutions and scientists, greater confidence, commitment, institutions to implement new paradigms of fire management with an intercultural view. And now, through the Landmark project, we create the confirmation of a multi-sectoral national working group on integrated fire management with the objective to escalate this experience at national level. It's really amazing how the firefighters in Parques, that is a national firefighters teams that promote this integration, they are our allies. They're implementing patch mosaic burning in different contexts along the country. And of course, we are in the plan to create a legal framework moving from fighter suppression to integrated and participatory fire management. Well, in conclusion, the promotion of participatory, inclusive, and multi-sectoral fire governance is a promising strategy for formulating effective and equitable policies for forest conservation and climate resilience, as well as fostering revitalization and indigenous cultural integrity. Thank you, Woki Perman.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Bibiana. That was great.
Thank you.
We have time maybe just for one quick question, clarifying question, if anybody has one, whether that's online or in the room here.
Nothing in the chat.
Nothing in the chat. Does anyone have a question here? We'll leave broader discussion until later, Bibiana. It seems like you presented very clearly there, so I think we understood what you were communicating there. So that's great. Thanks very much. And we'll come back to some of the bigger questions after the other talks.
Excellent.
Thanks very much. So we'll move now to Frank. If you want to share your screen, Frank.
I'm trying to find. Oh, there it is, right there. Good. This is the one.
Let's see. Yeah, here it comes. Okay, we can see it here, so I hope everyone else can see it. So, Frank, I'll let you introduce yourself. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning. I'm in the Northwest California, but my positionality as a person of mixed North American, Indigenous, and European descent. I affiliate more here with my Northwest California tribes. I'm a Forest Service research scientist who's been studying Indigenous knowledge in wildland fire and forestry for over 20 years. And I'm also a practicing cultural practitioner. You see here on the picture on the right, I serve often on wildfires as a resource advisor on heritage and cultural resources, but then also actively restoring and bringing fire back as a community and family cultural process in my area. Can you see my next slide? Objectives okay?
Yeah.
Great. So I really want to overview Indigenous knowledge related to cultural practices, particularly Indigenous fire stewardship, provide some of those examples and working with the Indigenous communities here, government and other non-governmental organizations and communities here in Northern California. there's been a series of questions that I'll go through and address here in my presentation that we are asked to keep it organized. So I'm here in Northwestern California in the western part of the United States, up by the Oregon-California border. As you see the slide on the left, California is a very floristically and ecologically diverse area with many different vegetation communities that have and were influenced and will continue to be influenced by indigenous cultural fire regimes. The black circle here in Northwest California in the center frame of the map shows the diversity of tribes in this area. I'm a Karuk descendant, and my half-siblings are Yurok, so a lot of cultural teachings and knowledge from that area. And then my work more broadly focuses here in the Pacific West, showing the more contemporary areas of the federally recognized tribes, particularly around wildland fire, forestry, and fire effects on heritage and cultural resources. One of the most important things here for factors of programs influencing fire governance in this area has been recently the United States last year, and I helped provide input on this, the guidance for the use of indigenous knowledge into federal governance. And particularly one of the other associated factors with that was a joint secretarial order that came out between the Department of Interior and USDA on part of the USDA and the Forest Service on co-stewardship and co-management of areas. And then really an important part for me as a research scientist, and it relates to fire and our wildfire crisis and climate crisis, is how indigenous knowledge is considered a valid form of scientific evidence, and it's the co-production of that best available science using indigenous and Western knowledge. From this understanding of looking at how wildfires have affected, the Forest Service developed a wildfire crisis implementation plan. The map in the lower right-hand corner, you see the clusters of kind of the maroon or dark red, is very much some of those high-risk fire watersheds, and a prioritization of that both by the non-governmental sector like the Nature Conservancy and others, recognizing that we have to be able to address and learn to live with wildfire. And many of the government, academics, and NGOs are looking to indigenous knowledge and tribal communities for that guidance. An important aspect that's really kicked us off and is now featured in President Biden's Wildfire Commission report, but started here off in California, particularly with the tribes I'm working with, is Assembly Bill 642 and then the Senate Bill 332 that defines cultural burn, which means the intentional application of fire to land by Native American tribes, tribal organizations, cultural fire practitioners to achieve cultural goals or objectives, including subsistence, ceremonial or ritual activities, or biodiversity or other benefits. And so for me, just a demonstration here on the right-hand side has been some cooperative burns with local tribal igniters due to Nature Conservancy's Training and Exchange, or TREX, as well now as helping facilitate my ability to burn with my children, as featured here on the lower right 2 years ago. A lot of this takes partnerships and collaboration. So when we think about, what are some of our motivations or tensions, it's learning to work together. At the federal government side, it's the government's trust responsibility or a federal obligation to work government to government. A lot of that has consultation directives, the new Forest Service Tribal Action Plan that's based in federal law, that trust responsibility, others being reaffirmed by treaties, congressional authorities, other executive orders, and legislative and judicial directives. So we have that at the national level focusing down. When we think about the fireshed or the tribal ancestral territory watershed levels, we work at the tribal and federal department levels across with our partners, usually on resource management or wildland fire and fire crisis landscapes, as well as for climate adaptation. And then where the main part for me, I see as a field scientist and as a cultural practitioner, is at that kind of crew or family level, at that person-to-person level, applying that indigenous fire knowledge, bringing indigenous and Western knowledge together, and how we go about developing our research methodologies, what those science support questions are and researchable questions, needs of the indigenous and community and managers, aligning those for what we pick as our metrics and our variables for how we develop our study design as informed by indigenous knowledge related to fire effects, and then be able to track that through and having a more inter-community approach. And a lot of that work developed here with the Karuk tribe, with the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership, and my other partner, the Yurok tribe, more on the coast. So a lot of this has to do with framing this. And this is, again, kind of, I call it the colonial no hypothesis, which is debunking that these were just natural fire regimes, but long time established, intergenerational, across millennia, cultural adaptations to climate and environment. We understand philosophically as a teaching that fire is medicine, living within a fire-prone ecosystem, dependent upon fire-dependent species as important resources, that then that cultural process modified fire regimes through cultural adaptations to become fire-dependent cultures. And that really varies across different habitats, ecosystems for those different species used as resources, but that's the foundation of understanding that principle as we move forward in the future for climate adaptation and living with fire. The main objectives here in the research is using interdisciplinary multiple methods to really look at how we think about governance. And again, governance can happen from at the family level, the village, the tribe, or even at the more kind of government to government level now, as we see in a more colonial format. But often it's acknowledging, different than lightning or natural fire, that the frequency was often more frequent in specific areas for resources than lightning. The seasonality diversified, which has implications for a lot of resources and species used for foods and medicines, often linked to phenology, which is an important part about adaptive fire use today. And then understanding the specificity of ignitions based on indigenous knowledge and values and achieving those objectives. But at the core of this is a sense of responsibility using fire or different burning practices across this landscape for a range of both social, spiritual, and governance of objectives. Within this, and I work a lot with the elder basket weaver and elder women as well as men, is to be able to recognize that different members of the community have different types of knowledge and have different roles. So understanding what their role and responsibility is. That's reflected in both their as being ceremonial leader or spiritually, whether there's subsistence into foods and basketry material and other resources, as well as today workforce around a restoration economy, as well as learning to live with wildfire. And often wildfires are an important economic factor in our community, but the disparity between that often is another issue. Working with diverse communities within this is another form of governance to consider, where we're doing our forestry monitoring with our plots here seen in the lower picture. That's an intertribal crew between the tribe, the local watershed council, my government agency, as well as then working with practitioners to evaluate those fire effects as we work together to do prescribed burns with cultural objectives and begin to expand cultural burning in other areas. Some of the way to frame this has been my involvement with paleoclimate and fire history studies. The fire history part of it is often going out and finding stumps. Here in our temperate area, we have annual growth rings. You can look at when the fire affects that cambium, the tree heals over, it creates a scar. And we've been able to see here on the map on the left, some of the historical mapping of the old trail routes and the villages, and in doing fire history and paleoclimate studies in these other areas. Much more frequent on average, like 6 to 7 year median fire return interval, some places even more frequent than just lightning ignitions alone. But that is a diversified place and elevation going from the river or the village corridor here, seen in this old picture on the left, moving up through different vegetation zones and using and applying fire there, as well as understanding the role of lightning ecologically and culturally. One of the main things that's really come out and has been really important to articulate, both as in the work of the process of science, but also having the practitioners and cultural knowledge holders, is to identify what indicators are thinking about. And that really ties to resource condition or site quality. These differ by different seasons. So as a scientist, are we collecting our data and evaluating fire effects based on that cultural metric of basket material quality or food resource quality? And are we collecting that data at the same time that normally would be traditionally collected? Part of those metrics often relate to diseases or pathogens, or it can be the shape, size, or morphology structure, both of the stem plant regrowth, but also of the trees or the forest, as indicators of cultural stewardship. It has a lot to do with access and mobility to site, often dealing with the surface fuel loading and the under-density thicket of ladder fuels or other fuels in the understory. The tree density, both related to canopy cover or closure and the understory lights, and the dynamics of that stand structure is important, as well as other indicators for evidence of animal use or human use within those. But really also now thinking about how climate is another factor we have to contend with, especially during droughts and other times. The way we've been able to advance this is to look at reburn, so modeling both lightning probability and indigenous ignitions on the landscape, to look at state and transition models for forecasting what our predicted vegetation communities will be in the future, based on historical information and contemporary indigenous knowledge in our treatments as well as practices. So that's some of the work that our partners are doing, looking at kind of those cultural ignition timings versus lightning, and then versus how we are kind of now using fire as a tool within the agencies and other cooperators. One of the approaches that we take here is, particularly in the Western United States, is to use silviculture or forestry to, particularly as informed by indigenous knowledge, to select those areas that we can have revenue. So actually kind of restoration logging and getting some of that to generate local economies, but also thinking about our conservation species or those species that might need also fire or climate refugia, and then more active areas to be able to reintroduce fire. This schematic I have on the lower right is looking at areas of resistance and resilience. So if we look on the lower left, we have kind of this treatment one where we have a really dense thick forest or a young plantation, but through a variety of indigenous and Western knowledge, thinking about what species we thin, which ones we retain in that vegetation or fuels, have that kind of pile burning or initial cleanup of the understory, followed up with other silvicultural or mechanical treatments, getting in there to do that prescribed burn with cultural objectives as kind of more of an inter-entity or main jurisdictional application of fire that eventually would get us going up to the upper right side of this perspective of high resilience and facilitating cultural stewardship, indigenous stewardship and cultural burning, where we've reduced the fuel loading, reduced the wildfire risk hazards, and be able to use fire in more diversified reasons and purposes. At the core of this is a lot around data sovereignty, particularly the way in which indigenous knowledge and historical information about tribes is being used. This is a big aspect of my research now, particularly around wildland fire science. So my climate adaptation work is to acknowledge the ways in which indigenous knowledge is contributed with free, prior, and informed consent, information about proprietary information, and what's appropriate to derive from open source or public domain data. And so that can be everything from looking at old stumps that have the cultural signature of fire regimes that are data, remote sensing LiDAR, or other things like even creating maps and village sites that might be proprietary information to the tribe, and going through a process to understand how tribes assert sovereignty and governance over that forms of data to inform our fire management and research. Here, just in closing, it takes a lot of partnership work to be able to do this. So this is examples of being able to do this work on my property as a demonstration site for tribal agroforestry, fuels reduction, and being able to reinstate cultural burning. And then the last part here is just to look now at cross jurisdictions, returning fire to a ceremonial area as our project sites, and being able to bring those local cultural practitioners who are agency specialists on the Forest Service side, such as myself and others, to be able to inform as we now work to do prescribed fires with cultural objectives and have that form of governance, our government-to-government responsibility within this area of ancestral importance to tribes, but also in the contemporary management with forest and climate adaptation. Thank you.
Well, that's great, Frank. Thanks so much. Yeah, and thanks for kind of sticking to time there as well. That's awesome. We do have time for a couple of quick questions, if anybody has them, whether online or in the room here. Yeah, great.
It might be one for later, though, I think.
Okay.
This presentation will be made available, so you can always go back. I packed stuff in there, so thank you.
Yeah, no, there's lots of stuff in there. Anything clarifying online? Or?
No.
I mean, I think, well, I have a bunch of questions. I think Kate has questions. I'm sure other people have questions that maybe cut across the different presentations. So we're a few minutes behind time, so we'll move on now. And we'll come back later to explore themes that are cutting across the different talks a little bit later. So thanks, Frank, and we'll move on to Amy now. If you could stop sharing your screen, Frank, I think maybe then Amy can share hers. And sorry if it feels like we're rushing through here. We just want to ensure there's some good time for discussion across the different case studies towards the end.
I should have stopped share now. Amy, you got it? Thank you.
Yeah, my problem is now I can't seem to see the tab that we just had before. So 1 second.
They always disappear when you want them.
Yeah. Maybe let me see here. Yeah, I don't seem to be able to share now.
I had to minimize a few things and then call open a little box to make it full screen so then I could see the share part, because initially I was having the same problem.
Yeah, I seem to see Zoom meeting in my inbox, but I don't see the PowerPoint. Let me just try to close it and reopen it and see if that helps.
I can always share.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I sent you guys the PDF as well there. I'll try
Yeah,
this,
really
and if that doesn't work, we'll go to the PDF.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
I see it now. It's popped back up.
Here it is.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yes, that looks great. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, thanks for having me here, and it was so great to hear Vivian and Frank speak as well on the amazing work that they're doing as well in their areas. So I'm Amy. I'm from the Cardinal and Labakan family from Treaty 8 territory. So I'm a Métis Nation citizen, and I'm currently living in Treaty 6. So for those of you that don't know, Treaty 8 is northern Alberta and Treaty 6 is central Alberta in Canada. And so I live in a town now called Rocky Mountain House, Alberta. And my current role is as an Indigenous fire specialist with Parks Canada with the National Fire Management Division. So it's kind of our national team that kind of coordinates and helps all the different national parks and historic sites when it comes to preparing for and responding to and recovering from wildfire. And so I'm a research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service, but I'm currently on secondment. So I thought what I would do here is just start with, speaking about, and I think it's great going after Frank and Bibiana, because I think this is more of like an operational presentation on what Parks Canada as a fire management agency is trying to do with like multi-stakeholder governance. And so I won't go as much into this, but as the past speakers mentioned, like Indigenous knowledge systems steward biodiversity, they provide nature-based solutions to climate change and also help with disaster risk reduction. And so in Canada, there's really no kind of pan-Indigenous knowledge where we have 3 different Indigenous groups according to our constitution. So First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and all of them can have totally different knowledge about how to steward and manage their territories. So Indigenous cultural burning is one way in Canada that different nations have basically been able to have a good relationship with the land and to promote like their continued basically ability to live there and carry out their culture. And so one writing by Stephen Pine, he kind of summarized that Indigenous peoples in Canada sought to replace fires of chance with fires of choice. Cleaning the land is something that you often hear from elders, and using fire to achieve specific cultural objectives. So an elder said, like, I didn't set the forest on fire just for the sake of burning, but so that I could return to hunt the next year and live. And so that was in 1979. When some research was done in my family's territory. And so on the left, you can see a picture of Indigenous people starting a prairie fire in 1903. And there's no symbol of what nation that is, but pretty sure that it's Blackfoot starting that. And then on the right is a current picture from a Cumberland house. And it's a group of Métis trappers who are out in the winter stewarding their territory with fire to promote muskrat. And so on the top too, if you're interested in this topic, we have a podcast series called the Good Fire Podcast that is available on all streaming platforms. And Frank has an episode on there. Jay Mystery has an episode talking about her and Bibiana's work that they've been doing in South America. So yeah, feel free to check that out. There's 2 seasons currently available. And so Parks Canada is a federal agency. And so basically Parks Canada manages all the different national parks and historic sites across Canada. And so I didn't include a map of that, but what I did include was a map of the different treaties, modern land claim agreements, modern treaties that have been signed across Canada. And so the federal government has a responsibility by signing these treaties with different nations to basically uphold the responsibilities in there. There is also a values and ethics code for the public service that says, that we have to act, in the interest of Indigenous peoples. The Constitution of Canada basically binds Parks Canada to recognizing Indigenous groups and that they are rights holders and not stakeholders in Canada. And so that we have an adherence to Indigenous rights, so both following inherent rights and then treaty rights as well. And then there's a new law that's just come into Canada, and it's basically Canada's UNDRIP, so the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it's called UNDA, the United Nations Declaration Act. And basically that says that Indigenous peoples have the right to steward their territories in the national parks and historic sites of Canada. There's much more in there, but that's really the claim that's specific to Parks Canada. And so one of the ways, you know, that we steward territory is through using fire. So as I mentioned, the National Fire Management Division at Parks Canada is kind of our national kind of oversight team. It's a small team. There's, I think, only maybe 19 or 20 of us on that team. And the commitments that team has made have been to, you know, continue to support community-led research on Indigenous fire stewardship, working with Indigenous partners and field units to deliver cultural burning workshops. And so that is basically not led by Parks Canada, but rather Parks Canada is just a partner that exists in those workshops to provide basically a space where Indigenous peoples can go out in their territories. Exploring and supporting partnerships with Indigenous partners and field units. So field units are basically our national parks, to develop Indigenous fire guardian programs. So the guardian movement has been huge in Canada. So basically the federal government has committed hundreds of millions to basically employment for Indigenous peoples in their territories, in their communities, to do all sorts of guardian type work. So that's environmental monitoring, looking at, you know, like the most popular one basically is the coastal fire guardians, where they go out and they do patrols. They do all sorts of environmental work there. But what we're really trying to turn that into is, you know, fire guardians, having people that are employed year round in sustainable employment to, you know, not only fight out of control wildfires that are threatening their communities, but also put fire on the ground in good ways, you know, during safer times to burn. And so the last one is continuing to work with international Indigenous partners to develop best practices on Indigenous fire stewardship. So that's where my work with Frank and others comes in. So one of the things that we form with Parks Canada to kind of get at this, you know, multi-level governance is the Indigenous Fire Circle. So this Indigenous Fire Circle provides our team and the field units of Parks Canada, so the different national parks, with strategic advice on the quality and overall development of the agency's fire management policies and programs. So really what it is a group where we can bring concerns, ideas, other things, or they can bring concerns, ideas, things for moving forward to us, and we can, you know, meet regularly and really talk through these things in a practical sense. Like, what can we do to remove barriers? What can we do to basically allow Indigenous people, or not allow, sorry, that's totally the wrong word. What we can do, you know, to support Indigenous people in getting fire on the ground. And so the membership of the group, you know, we've leveraged key relationships that we already have in place. So, you know, partners that we've worked with for a long time. We have representation across a range of specialties related to fire management. So, you know, firefighters, people involved in fire suppression, we have cultural burners, we have cultural heritage people on the team, we have youth, and so we've recruited observing principles of gender balance and diversity of experience, as mentioned above. So I currently sit as the chair of that group. And then we have basically Parks Canada fire staff who are Indigenous, and then non-Parks Canada Indigenous fire knowledge holders. So we currently have 7 that sit on the group with us, and they're compensated for their time, and we meet monthly. So one thing that we do is we contribute to reviews of the Parks Canada Agency's fire management programs and policies, and then we provide summarized findings and recommendations to the director of our national team. So one of the first things that we've really tackled with this group is, what is the difference for Parks Canada between cultural burning and prescribed fire? And this is something that we really see conflated a lot, especially by agencies in Canada. And so in the Parks Canada National Fire Management Plan and our prescribed fire standard operating procedure, the two practices are differentiated. but we've never kind of had a definition as to, what those actual differences are. And so one of the first big discussions that we had was about the term cultural fire. And so for some of the members of our advisory team, when we use the term cultural fire, it has a ceremonial meaning to them. So it's a specific ceremonial practice that they do, that's not related to kind of this land level stewardship. And so they had felt before insulted, when Parks Canada had come to them and wanted to do cultural fire on their territories, or support them in doing that, because they were like, well, why do we need your support to like carry out our ceremonial practice? And so what it is really is, we are looking now at, Indigenous or cultural fire, and then just making sure, that to notify our staff that, nations may have different terms they prefer to use, and that local terms should be used instead of these kind of generic ones. And so I won't totally get into all of this, but basically they're Indigenous led around cultural objectives and land stewardship, the creation of mosaics. They do also have spiritual ceremonial aspects, Indigenous knowledge driven around time to burn and techniques for burning, which Frank just talked about. And generally in Canada, even though there's no pan-Indigenous approach to burning, it's generally these slow, cool burns or fire that we can walk beside, that families can attend, elders, children, and they're matriarchal. And right now there's a bit of controversy over like, can a fire be a cultural fire or an Indigenous fire if there's the use of accelerants? So like drip torches, containing gas or other things, because they're basically introducing foreign substances to an area. And traditional fire lighting is preferred. And so it's also about more than fire and about living with the land. And so prescribed fire for Parks Canada is agency or organization driven. It's usually hazard reduction or ecological objectives, including restoration. Generally, it's production burning. They try to do as much as in as little time as possible. It varies in intensity, but can include crown fire replication, and many of our prescribed fires do that. And they follow like the incident management system, so paramilitary structure, top-down approach, bureaucratic, lots of use of accelerants, ping pong balls, helicopters, other things. And for many people, it's a job, right? And so it's working off of the land, and they don't have that kind of long history in the areas. And so this took our Indigenous Fire Circle quite a while to create, like to go back and forth kind of. And, it's really hard when you're dealing with so many different groups and nations that have different opinions. But it's been great that we've had the time to do that and really kind of set the scene for Parks Canada and our staff. And so the other one that we've really been getting into a lot is, what is an Indigenous liaison on incident management teams? And so I know in the States, it's much more common to have a tribal advisor that sits on incident management teams. But with Parks Canada, we haven't had that as a formal role. And so really we've worked with the Indigenous Fire Circle to look at, what is an Indigenous liaison? When should they be triggered to be involved in an emergency management team? Who that person should be. For many of our national parks with Parks Canada, like Banff, for example, there's like 20 different Indigenous nations that have claims to that territory, right? So it's not easy just to pick one person, to be that Indigenous liaison for all those other nations. So, how do we get around that? And our team the circle has come up with some really great suggestions there. And then also, what do those people do when they're on an incident, and what kind of role and function do they play to support the nation, but also to support our Parks Canada incident management teams? And so this summer I went up as an Indigenous liaison on one of the fires. And so this is our incident management team there. As you can see, no Indigenous or kind of local members were there, and the community was too busy responding to fires that had burnt multiple homes. And so I kind of sat in that role, like assisting with sharing information back and forth between the groups. One of the biggest things is gossip, right? Like people just talking about what's happening, what's going on, and being able to, chat with people, and alleviate some of the concerns. And on the right is a picture of one of the emergency managers. There, we take up in the helicopter and go and see, where are the fire guards, where's the fire, how far is it from their community? And that was something previously that the incident management team didn't really have time to take on because of the complexity of the incident. And so this is just a picture from Waterton Lakes National Park. So that's down in southern Alberta. And this is a cultural fire that happened there that was in partnership with the local, one of the local nations there with the Blood Tribe. And so I think it's kind of unveiled a confederacy marker, which is one thing that the Blackfoot use that the Blood Tribe uses in ceremonial practices. And this is a really important cultural area where like the beaver bundle was exchanged, which was kind of like a peace bundle between different nations. And so, yeah, it just is a good overview of, you know, what cultural fire can do and what a cultural fire really looks like on the ground. So yeah, I'll stop there. I don't even know where I am for time. Sorry, I can't see anything with the sharing of the screen.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, you did spot on there with time. That was awesome. Thanks so much. It was a little strange finishing these with no applause online, you know. But that was super interesting. Any quick questions for clarification on any particular terms or ideas, or just quick questions online, or if anyone's got their hand up online, anything in the chat?
Nothing in the chat, but I was just interested in the process for coming up with the definition of cultural burning. Of who did you involve in that process?
Yeah, it basically took 3 2-hour meetings of the Indigenous Fire Circle group. So that's the 7 external advisors. And then I think there were about 6 fire staff from Parks Canada. So what it really involves is like looking at, you know, what is cultural fire, like what's kind of the internationally recognized definition of it. Does that work for us at Parks Canada? Does that work for the nations that we're working with? And really just like walking through all of that. And I mean, what it comes with as well is, you know, it's a lot of stories, right? About things that have happened in the past, like that story about how the one person who's an advisor on the team, like they constantly were using like the term cultural fire when they were working with Parks Canada, which was actually quite offensive to them. And when they confronted the person, you know, they said, well, that's the internationally recognized, you know, term that we use. But really, you know, that's the guidance is there now that like with Parks Canada, we need to start using locally recognized terms to support our work with nations. So yeah, it's a lot. And I mean, it's expensive. Like, I'm not going to lie, like the honoraria that we provide is about $250 to $500 per meeting that people attend per person. And as well, it's sometimes very difficult as a government agency to pay honoraria. Like we can't just hand out, you know, envelopes of cash to people. So it's a lot administratively as well to run one of these types of groups.
Yeah.
Dennis
Yeah.
has.
I think we're going to have to move on to Francisco, unfortunately, because I know Francisco can't stay till the very end either. So we'll come back to Glynis later if that's okay.
Glynis will come back to you.
So thanks, Amy. We'll come back in discussion later. So hi, Francisco. Sorry, yeah, we're a few minutes behind, but hopefully it's
no
okay.
worries. No worries. I've told my students they're going to have to wait a little bit more for my sage words from the second half of the class. So yeah, they're a captive audience, so to speak. Okay, so I'm going to try to share my screen here. My screen, okay, you can see it, I imagine. Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Yeah, we've got it. Yeah.
So I'm going to change the conversation a little bit towards, you know, perhaps a pre-practice level because well, what I'm going to be talking about is the religious drivers of traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous local knowledge as compared in Morocco and Spain. And in both these countries now, the practice of fire and of cultural burning has been prohibited, though, as I will show, there is abundant evidence that that it was practiced in the past. So yeah, I'm really jealous, you know, when listening to Amy I couldn't listen to Frank and Bibiana, but I imagine they have programs on cultural burning going on there, that they're actually trying to put back those practices back in the ground, or maybe they never disappeared. The two places that I'm going to be talking about has disappeared, cultural burning has disappeared. So we're still at the stage of trying to understand what that cultural burning was, how it was practiced, what goals it had, both from the point of view of indigenous cultures, but also from the point of view of ecosystem management. Okay, so I'm going to talk then a little bit about these religious drivers of indigenous local knowledge, and trying to connect it as well to the impacts on landscape structure and function. Now, most of this research, most of what I'm about to say, or all of that I'm about to say, has appeared in a recent article, Cultural Dimensions of Forest Conservation and Landscape Ecology. One of the interesting aspects of this study is that we maintain, so to speak, the biophysical variables constant. Namely, we're talking about a relict fir forest ecosystem that only exists in southern Spain and in Morocco. But of course, one of the important differences between Spain and Morocco is that they have different religions and different religious traditions. So this was part of the idea behind this exercise, to think about the ways that these religious traditions may have been influenced the way in which these relict fir forest ecosystems were managed. So here are a couple of photographs of those ecosystems. The one on the left is Abies marocana, which is a subspecies of Abies pinsapo. These are some of the examples of the cultural landscapes. This is the town of Chifchaouen, and behind it in that mountain, well, the mountain to the right in the photograph is the Talasentan National Park. So all of these fir forests are protected by national parks. And that is part of the problem, I guess, because with the instauration of these parks, fire exclusion policies, and in general, policies seeking to curb traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous local knowledge-based practices have been prohibited for the most part in both countries, perhaps a little bit less in Morocco. Okay, so this is an example again of the villages that we visited in Morocco and the people that we talked to. As I mentioned, Islam is the main religion, and that, as you shall see, is not has important consequences in the terms these landscapes are managed. These are more examples of practices in Morocco and the landscapes in Morocco that we're talking about. Okay, this is a more of an example. Well, actually, let me go back to this picture for a second. As you can see in Morocco, precisely because it has started industrializing at a later date than Spain, many of the traditional ecological knowledge-based ecosystem management practices are still being practiced. Not all of them. As I mentioned, fire is currently not allowed within the park, more so than in Spain, because the landscapes that we have in Spain, which you can see in these photographs, are much more, if you will, post-industrial, in the sense that Spain already underwent its industrial phase, and now many of these fir landscapes have been converted to national parks. So right here you have an example of a Spanish ex-shepherd who's exhibiting, well, one of the signs of what park creation meant in the 1970s, as far back as the 1970s. Hunting is prohibited. For example, that's a difference with Morocco, where hunting is still allowed, but more on that in a minute. Okay, so these are the landscapes that we're talking about. We're talking about the landscapes of a developed country which has a Christian culture, and a developing country that has a Muslim culture. And in both places, we have the same forest ecosystem. That's what we found particularly interesting to contrast. So the methodology that we used, I'm not going to get into all of these details, but the methodology we used was a Q-based methodology, which is a semi-quantitative analysis of interviews. So our goal was to first identify differences between or similarities between resource users and park managers in both countries, and then draw on that to carry out follow-up interviews in which we could flesh out some of these ideas, particularly as related to landscape management, but also fire management of these different areas. Some of the questions that we used in these studies involved a characterization of traditional landscapes. So we asked about landscape preferences, assuming that landscapes that have been managed with traditional ecological knowledge-based techniques have a different appearance than ones that have ceased being managed, which have experienced management release as a result of the prohibition of all traditional practices. So we asked all of these questions, and in addition, we asked opinions on these landscape preferences. The first, landscape A, is abandoned. So this is basically the type of landscape that results from interrupting the practices that I'm about to describe. The landscape in the middle is a traditional landscape, but one which has been intensely used for shepherding, for pastoral activities and shifting agriculture. And the last one is an intermediate landscape. So interestingly enough, most of the park managers preferred landscape A. Most of the shepherds and agriculturalists, so the local resource users, the local communities, the indigenous communities, preferred landscape C and landscape B in that order. So, so clearly there, all of these perspectives were associated with also landscape preferences, which helped us a lot in the follow-up interviews. And sure enough, when we analyzed all the perspectives, there was a nice alignment of what we call local resource user or indigenous frames versus park manager frames. So if I recall correctly, factor 1 and factor 3, which are correlated between them, represent Spanish shepherds and agriculturalists, and factor 3 represents Moroccan pastoralists and agriculturalists and farmers, whereas factor 2 and factor 4 represent different sensibilities, mainly amongst park managers, some more sympathetic to these practices and some least sympathetic. The least sympathetic would be factor 2, factor 4, more sympathetic towards these indigenous practices. Okay, so we looked at all those different frames are summarized in this table, which you can consult in the paper. Okay, so as I mentioned, we carried out a series of follow-up interviews, and we discovered certain interesting ideas about how to use fire, how to use shifting cultivation. We separated all the management practices and the element into different columns. And basically, there were a series of characteristics that I'm going to describe in a minute with photographs, which is easier to identify. So in the last column, we can see that many of these practices are reported to have existed in Spain, but have disappeared. Although, as we shall see, there are also some important nuances derived from religious beliefs in terms of establishing some differences between these traditional practices for the management, remember, of the same type of tree species, of the same type of forest ecosystem. So in Morocco, there's still logging, pruning of lower branches and logging taking place, as you can see in photograph A. There's also extensive grazing, pastoralism within the park with cows. Cows are allowed to go feral, and they're actually then hunted, not shepherded in any way. They're allowed to go wild and then hunted, harvested by hunting by the indigenous local communities. And there's also rutas, or well, how do you translate it into shifting agriculture? So basically slash and burn. Here's an example of slash and burn practice on the upper left hand for preparing a cannabis field for cultivation. So in one of the big differences between the landscapes in Spain and in Morocco is that cannabis is culturally important in Morocco, because obviously alcohol is prohibited. So there's plenty of cannabis cultivation within the park with traditional local varieties, and it is practiced with shifting cultivation practices. As well as pruning that is also described in Spain. And this way of pruning the fir trees was used to manufacture certain traditional tools, such as the axis of the traditional Roman plow that is still used in Morocco, but is no longer used in Spain. So, so this is just a description of the practices that still exist in Morocco, but we went even further and we wanted to ask ourselves, well, what sort of differences exist between these traditional practices in Spain and Morocco, and what may be driving them? And we hypothesized that there may be some important religious factors here at work. So religious drivers of how these indigenous local practices and traditional ecological knowledge-based management practices have actually been shaped by religious belief. So one important aspect I just already mentioned is the difference between cannabis consumption in Morocco and alcohol consumption in Spain. In Spain, there's no cannabis cultivation, or cannabis cultivation is very marginal, was very marginal originally. So there was none of this slash and burn practice as much within the park. Another important difference is related not necessarily to fir trees, but to the oak species, oak forest patches that appear within the fir forest mosaic. So in Spain, because it's a Christian country, pigs are allowed to be eaten. And one of the big sources of food for pigs, of course, in Spain is acorns. So when oak forests are managed for pig production, for acorn production, they tend to be managed in this dehesa-like structure. So old trees separated between themselves, as in picture A, with abundant grass underneath, and also just a low density forest canopy, which allows the crowns of the trees to expand and get more exposed to the sunlight and produce more acorns. However, in Morocco, because pig is a taboo food, oak patches are managed much more, are kept at a shrub-like state. Why? Because the main livestock that is aimed for production in Morocco, in a Muslim country, is sheep and goats. And that requires basically the collection of large amounts of branches, which are used as bedding. Particularly the leaves are used as bedding, and the branches are used also for biomass burning and also the ashes are distributed later in the cultivated fields, et cetera, et cetera. And also we discovered, of course, well, not of course, but we discovered that possibly in Spain, these practices may have existed in the past. This is an example from the Alhambra in Granada, which, as you know, is a Moorish palace that existed in Spain in the Middle Ages before the country was reconquered by the Christian kingdoms. And well, we discovered that in the artwork, this seems to resemble juvenile Abies pinsapo trees, which are pointing in the direction of heaven. In this case, they're pointing in the direction of surahs of the Quran. So passages, they're connected to passages of the Quran. So the tree had a sacred value probably for Islam, and it's probably one of the reasons why these forests did not need much protection in the past. They were protected by the local communities because of religious beliefs. That is less the case, of course, in Spain, which has been Christianized slowly but surely, and we speculate about some of those differences in conservation resulting from this. So
it's going just about 13 minutes.
Yes. So briefly, the last couple of slides. Where does fire fit into this picture? Well, there's a big fire taboo. No one spoke to us openly about fire and the role of fire in managing these landscapes, what role it played in these traditional techniques, though we saw evidences of fire everywhere, particularly on the Moroccan side. Fire scars in the shifting cultivation fields, not only amongst the Pinus nigra trees, but also amongst the pinsapos themselves. So, conclusion. There's plenty of biophysical evidence that fire was used, and it was probably connected to these traditional practices that we have described, related to agricultural and pastoral uses. But fire, which is seen as a normal part of the landscape, particularly in Morocco, where there's still more of a memory of it, has been, of course, persecuted and banned by park authorities. This has been going on longer in Spain than in Morocco, and we argue that that is a problem. We believe that fire in Morocco and probably in Spain as well was related to shifting agricultural practices, shifting agriculture, which includes the felling of shrubs, not of trees, and the burning of these agricultural remains, of these forest remains to create ash and fertilizer for these fields. Just as a last conclusion, the cultural attachment to fir forests is, and this is our study revealed, is still stronger in Morocco, perhaps because that religious tradition is more alive in Morocco than in Spain. In Spain, curiously enough, now the forests are presented more as a symbol of nationalism. So that, I guess, shows also an evolution in spiritual values and its impact on conservation. Because the fir forests in Spain now are seen as a nationalist issue, but as a nationalist symbol of Andalusian regional identity, but at the same time that has meant excluding local communities from these landscapes. Whereas in Morocco, where there's still a longer religious tradition, where the religious tradition is still present, park authorities have been much more cautious about the outright prohibition of many of these practices, which continue to be tolerated. So I'll leave it at that. And thanks so much for your attention. I hope this has been interesting.
Great, thanks, Francisco. Yeah, that's really interesting. Great, so we've had 4 really interesting talks. Hopefully now we can move into some questions that try to cut across the 4 speakers. I can see the 4 speakers on our screen here. Hopefully others online can see them as well. So are there any questions we can see online that might cut across, or any in the room that we want to kick off with? Kate, did you have a question?
Yeah, so hi everybody, thanks for some great presentations. I don't think this necessarily applies to you, Francisco, but I was interested initially in the sort of multi-level governance, thinking about layers between government and local level. But actually what I'm hearing from quite a lot of you is that there's a lot of coordination that has to be done within a level amongst different people at the local level, local communities who have neighboring landscapes, neighboring territories. And I'm just wondering, how does that happen? Because it's one thing to, you were saying, Amy, sort of use the word to allow or permit, Indigenous peoples to practice fire in the way that is part of their culture, but that doesn't necessarily help you to achieve what a top-down planner might want to see in terms of a fire pattern, sort of an outcome at the end. But how does one at the local level, how do people talk to each other and coordinate who's burning when you have so many different motivations and knowledges and practices? I don't know who wants to start with that one.
Well, you directed to Amy initially. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Could you start, Amy?
I think Frank has his hand up too, but I'll just quickly say that, yeah, allow is like a slippery slope here, and that really makes Indigenous communities very pissed off here, to be honest, especially with Parks Canada. So what we're trying to do now is just recognize the inherent right that they have to burn, and then work with them to put fire on the ground, whether it's led by them or supported by Parks Canada. But yeah, I'll pass it on to Frank. I saw his hand up there.
I just was going to explain the condition here in California. So we have federal lands, private lands, and then state lands. And for our fire agencies, the Forest Service on those federal areas, most of the national forests have responsibility there for fire suppression and the use of prescribed fire or managing wildfires. Within the area of state responsibility area, we call it the CAL FIRE, or the State Fire Agency has that responsibility. Sometimes they delegate that area and more rural areas to the Forest Service as the more local fire suppression entity. But then you also, if you're going to use fire as prescribed fire, you have to not only get the permits, or like me as a private landowner initially, would have to get the permits from CAL FIRE, who oversees that state responsibility area, and then have to also go through the air quality districts to be able to have the emissions and have a smoke management plan in place with that. Now, when we go to wildfires or starting to burn larger jurisdictions for larger prescribed fires, now, especially on federal lands, and for wildfire management, they have what they call the Geographic Area Coordination Committee, and they generally look at allocation of resources for suppression, but they're also looking to that type of incident management team or moving towards larger scale prescribed fires.
Thanks, Frank. I think Francisco had your hand up next, and then Viviana afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah, so the situation in Spain is one of total fire exclusion, and in fact, the park, one of the park directors, one of the park managers with whom we went on a field trip, was almost the feeling that we had was almost like that he was on top of this fortress and he was looking at the valleys and he was pointing out there's fire risk in those agricultural fields because they use harvesters. So I'm really scared that a fire is going to start here and burn there. And I started talking about what he thought about applying prescribed burning, and it completely caught him off guard. He practically hadn't heard of prescribed burning. So that's the situation in Spain. But he was actually open to, after I explained how fire was used in Morocco for shifting cultivation and how that diminished wildfire risk, he was open to a discussion about that. In Morocco, there was actually an attempt at implementing fire exclusion policies within the park. And there were a series of intentional fires, which the park authorities interpreted as a warning on the part of the local communities, and particularly the cannabis cultivators. And the park director was fired and replaced by another park director who is much more sympathetic to local community traditional uses, and who has allowed certain parts of the park that had been fire excluded to for certain local practices to be reintroduced. In other words, cultural burning linked to the preparation of fields for cannabis cultivation with certain conditions. Cannabis cultivation, by the way, is legal now in Morocco for local use. So they've allowed only the use of local varieties, which are not as intensive in the use of chemical fertilizers or water, and they've allowed fire, cultural burning, associated to those shifting agriculture practices.
Thanks, Francisco. Viviana? You're on mute, Viviana.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, excellent question, because for Latin America, it's a very important topic, because, in Latin America, we have the highest diversity of indigenous community in the world. So there are different strategies. For example, Brazil now is adopting integrated fire management that involves the cultural aspect, the ecological, cultural, and firefighting too. But they implemented prescribed burnings, but it's a mixture because they involve indigenous people to do the prescribed burnings. It's very interesting, the table of the analysis of Amy. I was thinking about it, how we can define in the case of Latin America, because Prefogo, that is institution from Brazil, is a top-down policy, but involving local communities and trying to do the prescribed burning together, to decide when, where, how to do the prescribed burnings. In the case of Venezuela, is also interesting because it's trying to create a bottom-up policy involving, but at the same time is trying to involve different actors from the top. So, but in the case of Venezuela, the idea is to promote indigenous activity that with the suppression policies before it wasn't allowed. So it's an idea to create a bottom-up policy. The rest of the countries in Latin America are trying to adopt integrated fire management, but the misconception implementing prescribed burnings without including indigenous people. So now we are in the process to spread these experiences to include the participation of indigenous people in the region.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, we've got a couple of questions online. Could you read them out, Adriana?
Oh no, so I mean hands up. I mean
hands up.
There's
Okay.
Glynis and David.
So let's go to Glynis first. I think you had a question earlier, Glynis.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for some really interesting talks. I just wanted to ask Babiana, I just wanted to ask, just from a context point of view, you described quite a sophisticated process of participatory activities that involve the communities, and but also various levels of governance. And I wanted to ask you, how long did that take? Because often this is a big question, and it's a concern, and it's something that's underappreciated in governance, is how much time it takes to actually develop those relationships and for the process to actually happen. So that's the question I have for you. Yeah.
Excellent. Very good question. Well, it's really difficult to define if we decide that the process start with when the experiment started. It was a very long time. But in fact, when we discover the results, we did together the experiments. It was a gradual process. But I think the big change occurred when we have the content, we started the meetings. So in this moment, it took less time. We confronted many problems because I am from academic world.
Yes, yes.
You know that you have a short term from the projects. Usually 3 or 4 years, but it's not enough, because maybe this time in one project you gain the trust, you can organize the meetings, and the process to establish the bridges and the intercultural platform, it takes time. Once the trust is gained, is reached, it's incredible. The process is really fast, because the most difficult thing is to change the minds, to change the approach, because when the people, especially the policymaker, are convinced, they believe in it, the process is fast. But the most difficult. Now we are working in Argentina, a very different country, because Venezuela is tropical, there's a different culture, and Argentina is more European. And the process is completely different. We are working with islanders of the Paraná River that use the fire for different process. But the same problem. It's the same problem in Venezuela, because it's a suppression policy. But it's interesting. We learn that the problems are global. No, we have the same problems, but the solutions are local. So it's so difficult to say to you how long it will take. I think in Argentina it's going to take much, much more, especially now.
Okay.
But it's only, well, I share my experience, but again, it's difficult to say because, well, it depends of the local political
local context
situation and the
and the
social
response.
integration.
Okay.
Thank you for the
very,
question.
thank you very much, Babiana. Thank you.
Thanks, Bibiana. Okay, we are close on time, but David's
Yeah,
still got your hand up.
Yeah. Sign up for quite time, so.
That's okay. So thank you all for talking and sharing your knowledge. My question relates to the work you do and the now infamous WUI. And because that's a big focus of heightened risk to infrastructure and people. So what are some of the additional challenges you face with both in the WUI zones around Indigenous communities and around other towns where the connection to knowledge of Indigenous fire stewardship might be less recognized, and how do you overcome some of these challenges?
Thanks, David. So that's the wildland urban interface. Who'd like to go first? Frank, who'd like to go first on that one?
Yeah, actually, Amy and I wrote a chapter in a book on Indigenous fire stewardship in the WUI, so I'd reference to that because it has some good international examples. But here in Northwest California, with the National Fire Plan in 2001, it established a focus on developing local fire safe councils. Those fire safe councils at the federal funding and state level then began to look at homes or private property and road systems within that wildland interface. And then those began to be aligned since those fuels treatments and then the reintroduction of fire were taking place. The local tribes and basket weavers, and particularly the cultural practitioners, began to work with the council and then the other state and federal agencies. We're working with the WUI. It has been a lot of, looking at shared values, the risk of how to reintroduce fire in very small treatment areas that take a lot of intensive pre-treatment. But once you build out from that and protect the homes and then the egress routes or the roads adjacent to that and around your community and towns, there's a lot more acceptance in the last 20 years now for using fire across jurisdictions, like a training exchange or Trex burns or burning multiple private properties with modules that come in during that time of year in the fall. So it's really expanded, but it started off very slow, very cautiously, and you had to gain a lot of public support, particularly the landowners that were non-tribal, about why you'd be working with tribes and reintroducing fire for cultural as well as social objectives.
Thanks, Frank. Anyone else like to respond to David's question?
Yeah, I mean, David, as you know, in Canada, it's quite difficult. So we have like the loss of knowledge around fire is always hard for me. Like I think I put in the chat that Victor Stephenson talks about like that, the knowledge wasn't just dropped, it was forcibly taken from us. And so it's, it's a difficult thing even for communities that don't have this knowledge anymore or access to it. And then in Canada too, we've had a huge component of Indigenous peoples who have been wildland firefighters, right? And so are now integrated in that. And that's, the removal of fire from any space. But I think for Indigenous nations, they're much more open to using fire around homes, mowing the grass, as we say, just lighting up in the spring around your home. And yeah, I think that there's an opening with that, but I do think that it's, an issue that we need to overcome. And one way we're doing that is through, these camps with youth and other things where we're talking about, Indigenous fire practices, how it was done, how it was used around homes, how to make communities safer. And another shift has been like, many of our nations in Canada used to be semi-nomadic. And so, when we moved between summer and winter camps, we used fire to clear areas. So like, for example, when you left your summer camp, you would light up the ground. And then when you came back the next summer, it would be clearer and, clean for you and less risk of burns. But, as we don't move like that anymore. We're confined to reserves through the Indian Act. And so for First Nations people, so that's kind of added a level of complexity there. And like, how do we then adapt Indigenous practices around homes and making our communities safe to like our current picture in Canada?
Thanks, Amy. Francisco's got his hand up.
Right. So in Spain, in particular, there have been recent initiatives to reintroduce some measures of shepherding particularly in areas, well, in the edges of the park, in which, because the park is enmeshed, or well, there are various villages that are enmeshed within the park. And there was a lot of interest, again, in bringing shepherds, and I interviewed some of these shepherds and specifically asked them about the possibility of reintroducing fire. And again, they've suggested that there would be many areas in which fire would be useful, but so far the park authorities are a little bit reluctant. It's still a little bit of a dramatic leap to try to reintroduce prescribed burning, particularly in those edge areas where the park limits with these villages, and there are small agricultural land plots and also meadows that are located there. But there was a lot of interest amongst more than the park authorities, the forest engineers working under the park authorities, which are mostly biologists, in reintroducing fire. And when we told them about the different practices that still take place in Morocco, certainly the Spanish shepherds remembered many of these practices in the distant past, but also claimed that they had the knowledge at any given point in time to attempt to reintroduce them. So at least right now, what I feel is that there's more, more attention is being paid to these practices. There's more curiosity. So I guess that's a step in the right direction for park authorities. At least there's more curiosity in finding out what these traditional practices were as related to fire use, and how they can help specifically prevent wildfire risk in the park, which is right now the utmost concern in Spain, because there's enormous wildfire risk, and there have already been quite large wildfires in the edges of the park, all connected to wildland-urban interface kind of ignitions, accidental ignitions, etc.
Right, thanks, Francisco. Bibiana, do you have anything to say on the WUI?
Well, no, I would like to comment that here, Amy, indigenous people, Pemon people, use, usually fire every day when they go to the conuco to the forest for agriculture activities, to make clear the home, for defense to the animals, and use many to say that they have a good hand, and say that the family at home that prepare the fire to cook the priest. And it's very interesting, because when we ask more details about patch mosaic burning, I have my own idea, like academic, that they prepare, well, I'm going to burn here in this patch. They decide the moment where, of course, but in this type of fire that is very important, created the mosaic of different burning stories, they don't take care, because they start the burnings, and they don't decide, and they don't stop. So, wow, why is not a wildfire? Because they keep everybody in the community, keep the heterogeneity of the landscape. So areas recently burned stop the new burn. So they create this heterogeneity. And this is the problem when you stop doing these practices, because the fuel accumulation promotes wildfires. And when wildfire occur, what's the problem? Not only the wildfire, it's because there is an homogenization of the landscape. So it's so difficult to recover the patches, the mosaic of different patches, because you have the same zero time. The regrowth is the problem of wildfires is homogenize the area. So it's so important, this traditional practice, no? To keep this heterogeneity that at the same time keep the biodiversity. No, is well, for me it's very interesting the concept of traditional burning practices to keep diversity and to keep the balance in the mosaic between fire-prone ecosystem and fire-vulnerable ecosystem. Thank you.
Do you guys have any response? I mean, we're over time, but I'm just going to slip in one final question because I was thinking about this. Do the communities you work with think about landscape structure separately from fire practices, or are they enmeshed together? Could they, you know, thinking about mosaics of different land covers, do they? Is that an aim for them, or is it the practice of burning itself that is the focus, and the landscape structure is a secondary kind of outcome of that, or are they wrapped up together? I don't know if they separate these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main objective behind cultural fire and putting that on the land is so that you can sustain and be able to live on your territory, right? And one thing I kind of mentioned is Frank always talks about like orchards, like having like forest kind of orchards around you. And, you know, it's having the resources near you, right? So that's the idea behind mosaics too, is that you have lots of diversity around your area, so you don't have to go as far. So usually like when that's the thing we had about in that chart about prescribed fire and cultural fire, like for most communities when they're doing cultural fire, cultural burning, like fire is kind of the secondary part. The most important part is like the promotion of that cultural resource that fire will help to achieve. And so Frank, I'll let you go from there.
Yeah, I think it, you know, again, the colonial notion is for fire, we're reestablishing natural ecological disturbance regimes. No, we're reestablishing culturally mediated fire regimes, because it's been a long intergenerational millennia process of living with fire in fire-prone ecosystems that evolved fire-dependent cultures. And so this whole idea of heterogeneity, yeah, we recognize in our area here, topographic diversity, soils, potential vegetation, and in fire, but it's that cultural influence of fire for spiritual and subsistence and other purposes that define the very diversity that we're seeking. But unless we recognize that indigenous foundation of that, the achievement is not going to be what you think it is from a Western colonial perspective. And that's the lessons that we have to learn from being patient and humble and working with our indigenous partners as stewards and the youth.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, yes, very, very interesting question too. I was thinking in your question, and in the case of Pemon people, of course, there are differences between the structure of the land, of the vegetation, but especially what is the function of the fire. For example, they practice agriculture only in forests, not in savanna, because the soils are really, really very poor. And so all the process to incorporate nutrients and burning the trees is so interesting, so sophisticated. For example, when they produce the plot for agriculture in the forest, they cut the trees with the leaves, with the crown to the center, in order that when they start the burn, it is concentrated in the center and don't move to the outside and converting a wildfire. But the main purpose is because the leaves have more nutrients than the trunks. So in this area, they grow yucca, cassava, but they use to prepare the bread. They have different varieties of cassava, but the principal, the main, is in the center to capture the nutrients. So they use the structure of the vegetations to improve, to do best fires, but depend on the objectives, because it's different, for example, to hunt a breeze, to trap a tree, to promote the fructification of the fruits. So depend on the structure of the vegetation of the land, but also what is the purpose.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Bibiana. Well, unless there's any final burning questions in the room, we're way over time, but that's because we've been having a really interesting conversation. So I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us today. It's been really interesting. We've recorded this session and we'll make it available online. The recording from the other session will also be online, and for those who weren't able to be in that session, maybe you can watch those videos, and we'll try to find some way of being able to comment or reflect on the videos in the other session as well. And yeah, we hope to stay in touch because this is a really interesting area of work that we're really interested to hear. It's certainly in the Leverhulme Wildfire Centre. So thanks everybody also for attending and joining us. And I don't know when the next Leverhulme Wildfire workshop is, but sometime in 2024. We're already at the end of the year. So thanks everybody, and take care, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much for organizing this amazing meeting, to see all the talks, the speaker, amazing learnings today. Thank you very much for Kathy and James for organizing this meeting. And of course, Adriana, always. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Frank. Take care. Bye.
Bye.